There is a particular quality to the way silence settles over a battlefield once the smoke has cleared, a stillness that feels impossibly vast, as if the earth itself is holding its breath, and in that quiet space there exists a kind of reverence, not for what has been, but for the sheer enormity of what was. Tonight, I find myself standing in the imagination at the edge of such a place, somewhere in the rolling countryside of Europe, where the grass grows tall now, and the wind moves through it in long, sweeping gestures, carrying with it no memory of thunder, no echo of drums, just the patient rustling of stems and seeds, the soft conversation of leaves. The light here is gentle, filtered through clouds that move slowly across a pale sky, and there is a coolness in the air, the kind that speaks of rain having passed, or perhaps preparing to arrive, and the land beneath my feet feels solid, ancient, as if it has witnessed countless seasons, countless transformations, and has learned to simply exist, without judgment, without haste. I imagine walking through this landscape, not with any particular destination in mind, but with a quiet curiosity about what might be found here, what traces remain of a time when this very ground trembled with the movement of thousands, when the horizon was broken not by church steeples and farm cottages, but by columns of soldiers, by artillery batteries, by the ordered chaos of armies on the march. There is something deeply meditative about contemplating such vastness, the way history unfolds across terrain like water flowing over stone, shaping everything it touches, leaving marks both visible and invisible. And I find myself drawn to the details, the small particulars that bring a moment into focus, the way morning mist might have gathered in the valleys, the sound of wheels turning on dirt roads, the smell of wood smoke from 1,000 campfires. Europe, in the early years of the 1800s, was a place of extraordinary transformation, a continent caught between old certainties and new possibilities, where the structures that had held societies together for generations were beginning to crack and shift, where ideas about power and governance and human rights were colliding in ways both violent and profound. And at the center of this tumultuous period, like a storm that gathers energy from the very air around it, was a figure whose influence would reshape not just battlefields, but the political and social landscape of an entire age, a man whose name would become synonymous with ambition, with military genius, with the complexities of leadership and the costs of conquest. But before we arrive at that center, before we trace the movements of armies and the decisions of generals, it feels important to simply linger here in this imagined landscape, where the present and the past exist side by side, where a field of wheat might grow over ground that once knew the thunder of cavalry charges, where a quiet village road might follow the same path that supply wagons traveled, their wheels cutting deep ruts into mud. The thing about history, the thing that makes it so endlessly fascinating, is that it is never really just one story. It is thousands of stories, woven together, overlapping and diverging, each one containing within it the full complexity of the human experience, the courage and the fear, the brilliance and the folly, the moments of connection and the vast stretches of loneliness. And so, as I stand here, in this peaceful place that exists more in thought than in any specific location, I feel the weight of those stories beginning to gather, not pressing down, but simply accumulating like morning dew on grass, each droplet catching light, each one holding its own small reflection of something larger. The wind shifts slightly, bringing with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance I can hear the faint sound of water, perhaps a stream moving over stones, and I realize that this quiet attention to the world as it is perhaps the best way to begin understanding the world as it was, because the Napoleonic Wars, that great span of conflict that stretched across more than a decade, touching nearly every corner of Europe and reaching even beyond into Egypt and the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, that period of history which saw the rise and fall of empires, the redrawing of borders, the transformation of military strategy and political thought. It all began, as most things do, not with grand pronouncements, but with smaller shifts, with tensions building, with old orders crumbling, with opportunity appearing in the spaces where certainty used to be. And now, with the scene set, with the atmosphere established, we can begin to trace those beginnings, to follow the threads backward, to understand how Europe arrived at this moment of profound upheaval, and how one man's extraordinary trajectory would become inseparable from the fate of nations. The story begins, as so many stories of upheaval do, with a revolution. France, in the 1790s, was a nation tearing itself apart, reimagining itself, trying to become something it had never been before. The old monarchy had fallen. King Louis XVI and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had been executed, their deaths marking not just the end of individual lives, but the collapse of an entire system of governance that had seemed for centuries as permanent as the stones of Versailles. The revolution that swept through France beginning in 1789 was not a single event, but a cascade of transformations, each one building upon the last, each one releasing energies that had been suppressed for generations. It was philosophical and violent, idealistic and chaotic, driven by Enlightenment dreams of liberty and equality, but also by hunger, by rage, by the settling of old scores, and into this churning cauldron of change, into a France that was simultaneously trying to defend itself from external enemies and define itself from within, stepped a young officer from Corsica, an island that had only recently become French territory, a place that felt, in many ways, more Italian than French, more Mediterranean than continental. Napoleon Bonaparte, born Napoleone di Bonaparte in 1769, was 24 years old when the revolution truly began to reshape his world. He was small in stature, just driven by an intensity that some found unsettling, educated at military academies in France, trained in artillery, the technical branch of warfare that required mathematical precision, an understanding of trajectories and angles, of how to make cannons speak with devastating accuracy. His family was minor nobility, struggling to maintain position, and young Napoleon, the second of 8 surviving children, had grown up with a fierce awareness of status, of hierarchies, of the ways power could be gained or lost. He read voraciously histories and philosophies, absorbing the lessons of ancient Rome, of Alexander, of Caesar, imagining himself into narratives of conquest and glory. But in 1793 he was still largely unknown, still finding his way through the complex and dangerous politics of revolutionary France, where yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's traitor, where factions rose and fell with bewildering speed, where the guillotine worked tirelessly in public squares, its blade rising and falling, rising and falling. The moment that changed everything, the moment that brought Napoleon from obscurity into the light of attention, came at a coastal town called Toulon, where royalist forces opposed to the revolution had seized control, inviting in the British Navy to support them, creating a strategic nightmare for the revolutionary government. Napoleon, serving as an artillery officer, saw what others had missed. He understood that controlling the high ground, the forts overlooking the harbor, would make the British position untenable. He planned the assault with meticulous care, positioned his guns with mathematical precision, and when the attack came, it succeeded. The British ships withdrew. The town fell back into revolutionary hands, and Napoleon, wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, suddenly had a reputation. He was 24 years old, and he had proven himself not through reckless courage, though he had that, but through strategic thinking, through the ability to see the geometry of battle, to understand how terrain and firepower could be combined to create decisive results. The recognition came swiftly. Promotion to brigadier general. Assignments of increasing importance, but the path was never smooth, because revolutionary France was a place where fortune could reverse in an instant, and Napoleon, for all his growing reputation, was still vulnerable to the shifting political winds. In 1795, he found himself in Paris, somewhat sidelined, his career uncertain, watching as the revolution continued to devour itself, as new constitutions were written and discarded, as power consolidated around a 5-member directory that governed France with varying degrees of competence and corruption. And then, in October of that year, royalist forces within Paris itself rose up, threatening to overthrow the directory. Thousands of armed insurgents moving through the streets, converging on the Tuileries Palace, and the government, desperate, turned to Napoleon, giving him command of the forces defending the regime. He had almost no time to prepare, but he remembered the lessons of Toulon. He understood the power of artillery, and he sent a young cavalry officer, a man named Murat, who would later become one of his most famous marshals, to seize the cannons stored at a nearby military depot. And when the royalist columns advanced, confident in their numbers, Napoleon unleashed what he would later call, with characteristic bluntness, a whiff of grape shot. The cannons fired, loaded with grape shot, hundreds of small metal balls that turned each gun into a giant shotgun, scything through the advancing crowds. The sound was tremendous, echoing off the buildings, rolling through the narrow streets like thunder. And the insurgent forces, faced with this devastating firepower, broke and scattered. The uprising collapsed in a matter of hours. Napoleon had saved the directory, and his reward was rapid and substantial. Command of the Army of Italy, one of the major French forces, an appointment that would change not just his life, but the course of European history. Italy in 1796 was a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies, many of them under Austrian influence, and the French army stationed there was undersupplied, demoralized, poorly equipped, facing Austrian and Piedmontese forces that seemed better organized, better funded, more confident. Napoleon arrived and immediately began transforming everything. His energy was relentless. He reorganized supply lines, imposed discipline, but also inspired his soldiers with a kind of electric enthusiasm. He promised them not just victory, but glory and plunder, the riches of Italian cities, the satisfaction of defeating enemies who had seemed invincible. His strategy was bold, almost reckless. He moved with a speed that caught his opponents off balance, striking at the seam between the Austrian and Piedmontese armies, preventing them from coordinating, defeating them in detail, one after another, at Montenotte, at Lodi, at Arcole, at Rivoli, each battle a masterclass in rapid movement, in concentration of force, in the element of surprise. The crossing of the bridge at Lodi became legendary. Austrian forces defending the far side, Napoleon personally leading the assault, urging his men forward across the narrow span, under withering fire, the moment crystallizing his image as a commander who shared the dangers of his soldiers, who led from the front, who seemed to bear a charmed life. Within a year he had conquered much of northern Italy, forced Austria to the negotiating table, and returned to France as a hero. The young general from Corsica was now, at 28 years old, the most celebrated military commander in Europe. His victories had brought desperately needed gold and supplies back to France. His dispatches, carefully crafted to emphasize his achievements, were read aloud in Paris to cheering crowds. But Napoleon was already thinking beyond Italy, already imagining grander campaigns, and when the opportunity came to lead an expedition to Egypt, to strike at British interests in the Mediterranean and the routes to India, to follow in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, he seized it with both hands. The Egyptian campaign of 1798 was both triumph and disaster, a strange combination of military success and strategic failure. Napoleon conquered Egypt with relative ease, defeating the Mamluk armies at the Battle of the Pyramids, entering Cairo as a conqueror, presenting himself as a liberator, bringing French scholars and scientists who would study and document the ancient wonders of the Nile Valley. But the British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at Aboukir Bay in the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon and his army in Egypt, cutting them off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any easy path home, and Napoleon, always attuned to political currents, began to sense that the situation in France was deteriorating, that the Directory was losing control. That opportunity was calling from across the Mediterranean. He abandoned his army in Egypt, left them under the command of subordinates, and sailed back to France in 1799, a risky journey that could have ended in capture, but instead ended with his arrival in Paris, where he found, as he had suspected, a government in crisis, a nation hungry for strong leadership, for someone who could restore order, who could protect the gains of the revolution while ending its chaos. The coup that brought Napoleon to power, known as the coup of 18th Brumaire, was almost farcical in its execution. Nervous speeches, confused legislators, Napoleon himself tongue-tied and uncertain at crucial moments, but backed by loyal troops, supported by his brother Lucien, who was president of the council. The coup succeeded. The Directory was dissolved, and a new government emerged, the Consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. He was 30 years old, and he now controlled France. Not as a king, the revolution had made that impossible, but as something new. A leader who claimed to embody the will of the people, who promised stability without tyranny, progress without chaos, a figure who would, in the years to come, crown himself emperor, but who began in those first months of 1800 as the man who promised to heal a wounded nation. The France that Napoleon inherited was exhausted, but also hungry for something it had lost in the years of revolutionary turmoil, a sense of possibility tempered by order. And he set about providing exactly that, with an energy that seemed to defy the need for sleep, for rest, for anything but constant motion and decision-making. He rose early, worked late, consumed information like a man starving for it, reports from prefects, intelligence from abroad, financial statements, diplomatic correspondence. His mind was a machine for processing detail, for finding patterns, for making connections that others missed. And he expected the same intensity from everyone around him, secretaries who could barely keep pace, ministers summoned at all hours, a court that revolved entirely around his will. But this was not mere tyranny, or at least not only tyranny, because Napoleon understood something fundamental about power, that it must deliver results. That legitimacy comes not just from force, but from achievement, from making people's lives tangibly better. And so even as he consolidated control, even as he limited press freedom and suppressed opposition, he also reformed France from top to bottom. The Napoleonic Code, the civil law system he commissioned and personally helped shape, became perhaps his most enduring legacy. It swept away the tangled mess of feudal laws and regional customs that had governed France before the Revolution, replacing them with a clear, rational, unified legal framework. It established equality before the law, protected property rights, secularized marriage, made divorce possible, though harder for women than for men. It was both progressive and conservative, both revolutionary and traditional, much like Napoleon himself. The Concordat with the Catholic Church, signed in 1801, healed another wound, restoring some of the Church's position in French life, but carefully, on terms that kept the institution subordinate to the state. Napoleon understood that most French people remained Catholic, that their faith mattered to them, but he also understood that the revolution's anti-clerical impulses had struck at real abuses, real concentrations of unaccountable power, and so he sought a middle way, one that brought stability without surrendering control, education, infrastructure, administration. He touched all of it, creating lycées to train future leaders, establishing the Bank of France to stabilize currency, organizing the country into departments governed by appointed prefects who reported directly to Paris, building roads and canals, commissioning monuments, everything calculated to demonstrate that France under Napoleon was efficient, powerful, modern, a state that worked, but France could not exist in isolation, and Napoleon knew it. Europe's old monarchies, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain above all, watched his rise with deep suspicion. They had gone to war against revolutionary France multiple times, trying to crush the revolution, to restore the Bourbon monarchy, and now this Corsican upstart who commanded French armies with unsettling brilliance, who seemed to win battle after battle, who spoke of destiny and glory. He was, in their eyes, both the heir to the revolution's chaos and something new, something potentially more dangerous. The Peace of Amiens, signed with Britain in 1802, was brief, fragile, a temporary pause in hostilities that both sides knew would not last. Napoleon used it to consolidate, to prepare, to build the foundations of what would become his empire. And when war resumed in 1803, it resumed with a new intensity, a new scale. Britain formed the Third Coalition, drawing in Austria and Russia, and Napoleon, now crowned Emperor of the French in an elaborate ceremony in 1804, where he placed the crown on his own head rather than receiving it from the Pope. Napoleon prepared to meet them, assembling what would become known as the Grande Armée, the Great Army, along the Channel coast, ostensibly for an invasion of Britain, though that invasion would never come. The British Navy was too strong, too experienced, and at Trafalgar, in October of 1805, Admiral Nelson, even as he died from a French sharpshooter's bullet, secured British naval supremacy for a generation, destroying the combined French and Spanish fleets, ensuring that Britain would remain unconquerable, that Napoleon's empire, however vast it became on land, would always face an enemy it could not reach, could not defeat, could not silence. But on land, Napoleon was about to demonstrate military genius at its apex. The Austrian army was marching west, confident, well supplied, supported by Russian forces moving to join them, and Napoleon, with that same speed that had served him in Italy, broke camp along the Channel, wheeled his entire army eastward, and moved with such velocity that he caught the Austrians completely unprepared. At Ulm, in October of 1805, he surrounded an entire Austrian army, cutting it off from supply and support, forcing its surrender without a major battle. 30,000 men simply captured, removed from the board, and Napoleon marched on toward Vienna, which he entered without resistance, the Austrian capital occupied by French forces, a humiliation that would have seemed impossible mere months before. But the real test came in December in Moravia, at a place called Austerlitz, where Napoleon faced the combined might of the Austrian and Russian emperors, their forces outnumbering his, their confidence high, their position, they believed, advantageous. Napoleon planned the battle with the care of a master chess player. He studied the terrain, the rolling hills, the frozen ponds, the morning mist that would cloak the field. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look vulnerable, inviting attack, and when the Allied forces took the bait, pushing hard against that seemingly weak position, he unleashed his real blow, a massive assault against their center, cutting their army in two, sending one half reeling back, driving the other onto the frozen lakes where French artillery shattered the ice, plunging men and horses into freezing water. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought on the first anniversary of Napoleon's coronation, was his masterpiece, a victory so complete, so devastating, that it shattered the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace immediately. Russia withdrew its forces, and Napoleon stood astride Europe like a colossus, redrawing borders, creating new kingdoms for his brothers and marshals, dissolving the ancient Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in some form for 1,000 years, simply erasing it from the map. The years that followed, 1806 through 1807, saw more campaigns, more victories. Prussia. Proud Prussia, with its military traditions stretching back to Frederick the Great, entered the war in 1806 and was crushed with shocking speed. Napoleon defeated the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt on the same day. Twin battles fought simultaneously, both resulting in Prussian collapse, and within weeks, French forces occupied Berlin. The Prussian king fled east, seeking Russian protection. The campaign pushed into Poland, into the bitter cold of an Eastern European winter, and at Eylau in February of 1807. Napoleon fought one of his bloodiest battles, a grinding, brutal engagement in a snowstorm, where neither side could claim clear victory, where the dead piled up in drifts, where the cost of glory became visible in ways that made even Napoleon pause, though only briefly. By summer, at Friedland, he had recovered his momentum, crushing the Russian army, forcing Tsar Alexander to negotiate, and the two emperors met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit in July of 1807 to divide Europe between them, France dominant in the west, Russia given a free hand in the east, an alliance that seemed to promise peace, stability, a new order. Napoleon was 38 years old, master of an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to southern Italy. He had redrawn the map of Europe, defeated every major power except Britain, and he seemed, to many observers, to have achieved something permanent, something that would last. But empires are hungry things. They must expand or contract. They cannot remain still. And Napoleon, for all his genius, could not see the cracks already forming in the structure he had built, could not recognize that his very success was creating the conditions for his downfall, the continental system, his attempt to strangle British trade by closing European ports to British goods required constant enforcement, constant vigilance. It created hardship for European merchants and consumers who wanted British products. It bred resentment, smuggling, resistance, and it pulled Napoleon into conflicts he might otherwise have avoided. Spain, in 1808, became a wound that would not heal. Napoleon deposed the Spanish Bourbon king, placed his brother Joseph on the throne, and expected Spain to accept this as other nations had accepted his reorganizations. But Spain erupted, not in conventional warfare, but in guerrilla resistance, irregular forces striking from mountains and villages, melting away before French counterattacks, tying down hundreds of thousands of troops, bleeding the empire slowly, relentlessly. The British, sensing opportunity, sent an expeditionary force under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, to support the Spanish and Portuguese resistance. And what began as a sideshow became a running sore, a constant drain on French resources and prestige, the Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon would later call it, that consumed men and money and time. And yet, even as Spain festered, Napoleon was planning something grander, something that would dwarf all his previous campaigns. Because Russia, despite the Treaty of Tilsit, was drifting away from the continental system, trading with Britain, asserting its independence, and Napoleon, who could not tolerate defiance, who saw opposition as a challenge to be crushed, began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen. The Grande Armée of 1812 numbered over 600,000 men, drawn from across the empire, French, Germans, Italians, Poles, a multinational force of staggering size, organized with typical Napoleonic precision, divided into corps that could operate independently, supported by massive supply trains, all aimed at a single objective: to march into Russia, to force Tsar Alexander to submit, to demonstrate once and for all that Napoleon was invincible. In June of 1812, they crossed the Niemen River. the same river where Napoleon and Alexander had met 5 years before to divide the world, and began the long march east into distances that seemed to have no end, into a landscape that swallowed armies whole. The Russian campaign began with confidence, with the assurance that had carried Napoleon through so many previous victories. But Russia was different, vast in ways that defied European understanding, a country where distance itself became a weapon, where the horizon always promised another horizon beyond it, where armies could march for weeks and still find themselves far from anything that mattered. The Russian strategy, whether planned or improvised, was to retreat, to draw the French deeper and deeper into the interior, to stretch their supply lines until they became threads, gossamer thin and ready to snap. French forces won battles at Smolensk, at Valutino, but these were hollow victories because the Russian army always withdrew, always remained intact, always positioned itself just beyond reach. Napoleon pushed forward, driven by the belief that one decisive battle would end it, that the Russians would eventually stand and fight and be destroyed, as so many other armies had been destroyed. And in September, at a village called Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, the Russians finally stopped retreating. They fortified positions along ridges and hills and waited for the French to come. The Battle of Borodino was carnage on a scale that shocked even veterans of Napoleon's previous campaigns. The French attacked. The Russians held. Batteries of artillery on both sides fired until the gunners were deafened, until the smoke became so thick it blotted out the sun. Infantry charged and countercharged across fields that became slaughterhouses. The fighting lasted from dawn until evening, neither side giving ground easily, neither side willing to break. When night finally fell, when the guns at last went silent, 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The butcher's bill split almost evenly between the two armies. The Russians, their forces too damaged to continue, withdrew during the night, leaving a Napoleon in possession of the battlefield, technically victorious, but at a cost that would have seemed unthinkable in earlier campaigns. A week later, the Grande Armée entered Moscow, the ancient capital, expecting to find submission. Instead, they found a city largely abandoned, and within hours, fires began, spreading through the wooden structures, consuming neighborhoods, turning the sky orange and black, whether set by Russian patriots or simply the chaos of occupation. The fires destroyed much of the city, leaving the French army camped among ruins, waiting for a surrender that never came. Napoleon remained in Moscow for 5 weeks, a strange interlude. As autumn deepened and the first frosts appeared, he sent letters to Tsar Alexander, proposing peace, offering terms, receiving no reply. The silence from St. Petersburg was absolute, and slowly, reluctantly, Napoleon began to understand that he had walked into a trap of his own making. The retreat began in October, and almost immediately the weather turned. Early winter storms brought snow and freezing temperatures. The Grande Armée, already weakened by battle and disease, by the long march into Russia and the weeks camped in Moscow's ruins, began to disintegrate, not through defeat in battle, but through the relentless arithmetic of cold and hunger. Soldiers abandoned equipment to move faster, then abandoned weapons, then abandoned everything but the will to keep moving. Supply wagons broke down. Horses died by the thousands, and Cossack cavalry, Russian irregular forces, harried the columns constantly, picking off stragglers, attacking foraging parties, turning the retreat into a running nightmare at the Berezina River, with Russian armies closing in from multiple directions. French engineers built bridges under fire in freezing water while the remnants of the army struggled across, pushing and shoving, desperate to escape the trap. Thousands drowned, thousands more were captured, and when Napoleon finally crossed back into Poland in December, when he finally escaped Russian territory, he had perhaps 30,000 combat-effective troops left out of the more than 600,000 who had crossed the Niemen in June. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. An entire army, the finest force Napoleon had ever assembled, essentially destroyed, not in a single catastrophic battle, but through a slow hemorrhage of men and materiel across 1,000 miles of retreat. And the political consequences rippled outward immediately. Prussia, which had been forced into alliance with France, saw its opportunity and switched sides. Austria, always waiting for the moment when Napoleon's luck would turn, began preparing for war, and across Germany, nationalist sentiment stirred, a sense that perhaps the great emperor was not invincible after all, that perhaps the time had come to throw off French domination. Napoleon returned to Paris, left his army to struggle home under its marshals, and immediately began rebuilding, calling up new conscripts, boys of 16 and 17, men who should have been farmers or apprentices, pressing them into service, drilling them, equipping them with whatever could be manufactured or found. And by spring of 1813, he had assembled another army, smaller than before, less experienced, but still formidable. The campaign in Germany that followed, the War of the Sixth Coalition, was a desperate affair. Napoleon won battles at Lutzen and Bautzen, showing that he could still outmaneuver and defeat his enemies, but he could not win decisively, could not replicate the crushing victories of Austerlitz or Jena, because his enemies had learned. They avoided set-piece battles where Napoleon's genius could shine. They coordinated their movements. They waited for advantages, and slowly, through the summer and fall, they ground down French forces through sheer weight of numbers. At Leipzig, in October of 1813, in what became known as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon faced the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, more than 300,000 Allied troops surrounding his position, and for 3 days the battle raged across fields and through villages, French forces fighting with desperate courage, knowing that this might be their last chance, but outnumbered, outgunned, slowly being pushed back, compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, when his forces attempted to withdraw across the Elster River, the bridge was blown prematurely, trapping thousands on the wrong side, and the Grande Armée, what remained of it, staggered back toward France, defeated, exhausted, leaving Germany to the Allies. By the start of 1814, Allied armies were crossing into France itself, Russian, Prussian, Austrian forces advancing from the east, British and Spanish forces pushing across the Pyrenees from the south, and Napoleon, with perhaps 70,000 troops, faced more than 500,000 enemies converging on Paris. The mathematics were impossible, the situation hopeless. And yet, the campaign he fought that winter and spring, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, defending his own territory for the first time, showed flashes of the old brilliance, rapid marches that caught Allied columns separated, attacks that hit with precision at Champaubert, at Montmirail, at Montereau, small victories that reminded everyone why this man had once seemed unstoppable. But individual victories could not change the overall equation. Paris fell in March. The Senate, filled with men Napoleon had appointed, voted to depose him. His marshals, exhausted, seeing no path to victory, urged him to abdicate. And finally, in April of 1814, he signed the document, gave up the throne, accepted exile to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast, close enough to see the mainland, far enough to be isolated. The Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returned from exile to claim a throne that must have felt strange after 23 years of revolution and empire, and Europe's diplomats gathered in Vienna to redraw borders, to restore old dynasties, to try to put the pieces back together after more than 2 decades of nearly continuous warfare. Napoleon, on Elba, was supposed to fade into history to accept his small realm, his pension from France, his title of Emperor of Elba, which sounded almost comical, but exile did not suit him. And when news reached him of discontent in France, of the unpopularity of the restored Bourbons, of veterans who remembered glory and resented the return to the old ways, he made a decision that would give the world one final act in the drama. In March of 1815, he left Elba with about 1,000 men, landed in southern France, and began marching north. And as he marched, something extraordinary happened. The soldiers sent to arrest him, veterans who had fought under his command, defected, joined him, entire regiments going over to their old emperor, until by the time he reached Paris, he commanded an army, and King Louis fled, disappeared into the night, leaving Napoleon to reclaim power almost without firing a shot. The 100 days, as this brief restoration would become known, was a feverish time. Napoleon tried to present himself as changed, as constitutional, as ready to rule with moderation, but Europe's powers were not interested in negotiation. They declared him an outlaw, assembled their armies, and prepared to crush this final defiance. The campaign was short. Napoleon moved into Belgium, trying to defeat the Allied armies before they could unite. He caught the Prussians at Ligny and drove them back, but failed to destroy them. And then, on June 18th, 1815, on fields south of Brussels, near a village called Waterloo, he faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, with the Prussians somewhere to the east, their exact position unclear. The Battle of Waterloo was confusion and courage, infantry squares holding against cavalry charges, artillery firing at point-blank range. Wellington's forces bent but did not break, holding a ridge, absorbing assault after assault, and then, in the late afternoon, Prussian forces appeared on Napoleon's flank, tired from their march but arriving in time, and the French position, already strained, collapsed, turned into rout, soldiers throwing down weapons and running, the carefully maintained order dissolving into chaos. Napoleon fled, returned to Paris, abdicated again, this time with no conditions, no negotiated exile, and threw himself on British mercy, hoping for asylum. Instead, he was sent to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, as remote as anywhere on earth, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean, where escape was impossible, where even hope seemed distant. He would live there for 6 years, dictating memoirs, refighting old battles in conversation, slowly declining in health until his death in 1821, at age 51, removed from the world stage but never quite forgotten, his legend already beginning to calcify, to transform from the reality of the man into something larger, something mythic. The wars that bore his name, the Napoleonic Wars, had reshaped Europe utterly. More than 3 million soldiers and civilians dead, borders redrawn, political systems transformed. The balance of power fundamentally altered, and in their wake, questions remained about leadership and ambition, about the costs of glory, about what it means when one person's will bends the course of history, and yet, when the smoke cleared, when the armies disbanded and the soldiers returned to their villages and farms, or did not return, when the diplomats finished their work in Vienna and the maps were signed and the treaties ratified, what remained was not just the memory of battles, but something more subtle, more pervasive, a transformation in how people thought about nations, about citizenship, about their relationship to power, because the Napoleonic Wars had done something unexpected. They had spread ideas even as they spread destruction. The armies that marched across Europe carried with them the principles of the French Revolution: equality before the law, merit over birthright, the notion that a government should serve its people rather than the other way around. And even those who fought against Napoleon, even those who died resisting French occupation, absorbed these ideas, could not unhear them once spoken. The nationalism that would reshape the 19th century, that would lead to German and Italian unification, that would ultimately contribute to the catastrophes of the 20th, it was born in part from resistance to Napoleon, from the experience of being occupied, of having foreign soldiers in one's streets, of realizing that one's identity as Prussian or Spanish or Russian mattered, that it was worth fighting for, worth dying for. The military innovations, too, the way Napoleon organized his armies into self-sufficient corps, the emphasis on speed and concentration of force, the use of artillery as a mobile striking weapon rather than static defense, the reliance on living off the land rather than slow-moving supply trains. All of this would influence military thinking for generations. Staff colleges would study his campaigns. Generals would try to replicate his methods, even as they learned from his mistakes, from the hubris that led to Russia, from the inability to know when to stop. And in France itself, the legacy was complicated, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The Napoleonic Code would endure, would be adopted in modified form by dozens of countries, its clarity and rationality a genuine improvement over what came before. The educational institutions he founded would produce leaders and thinkers for centuries. The meritocratic ideal, however imperfectly realized, had been planted too deeply to be entirely uprooted by the Bourbon Restoration. But the cost was written in cemetery records across Europe, in parish registers recording deaths in foreign lands, in the women who never married because there were no men to marry, in the children who grew up fatherless, in the treasury debts that would take generations to repay, in the art looted from conquered cities, in the physical scars left on landscapes where battles were fought, cannonballs still occasionally plowed up in Belgian fields, foundations of burned buildings discovered during construction projects, the earth itself remembering. There is something profoundly human about the story, about a man of extraordinary ability who rose from relative obscurity to reshape the world, who possessed genuine genius alongside equally genuine flaws, who could inspire fierce loyalty and create lasting institutions while also causing suffering on a scale that staggers the imagination. It resists simple judgments, refuses to be only heroic or only villainous, exists instead in that complicated space where most human stories actually unfold. The soldiers who served under him, who survived and grew old, often spoke of those years with a strange mixture of emotions: pride at having been part of something grand, horror at what they had witnessed, nostalgia for youth and comradeship, relief at having survived. They would gather in taverns on anniversaries, wearing old uniforms that no longer fit quite right, and remember, not always accurately, but deeply, the feeling of marching in those great columns, of believing they were making history, of being young and alive when the world seemed infinite with possibility. And perhaps that is the most lasting thing, not the borders that were redrawn or the battles that were won and lost, but the simple fact that ordinary people, farmers and clerks and shopkeepers who became soldiers, had their horizons expanded, saw other countries, other ways of living, experienced things they could never have imagined in their villages, returned changed, if they returned at all, carrying stories that would be retold to children and grandchildren, becoming part of family mythology. The great-grandfather who served in the Grande Armée, who saw Moscow burn, who crossed the Berezina, who was at Waterloo. The years passed, decades, then centuries, and the Napoleonic Wars receded into the comfortable distance of history, no longer living memory but studied memory, analyzed and debated. The battlefields became tourist sites. Museums displayed uniforms and weapons. Artists painted romantic scenes of cavalry charges and last stands. And slowly, gradually, the specific horror was forgotten, while the general fascination remained. And so we return, in imagination, to that quiet field where we began, where the grass grows tall and the wind moves through it with patient repetition, where the earth has long since absorbed what it once witnessed, where farmers plant crops and children play, unaware or only dimly aware of what happened here. In this place that is simultaneously ordinary and saturated with the past, the afternoon light has shifted, grown softer, more golden, the way it does when the sun begins its slow descent toward evening, and in this gentler illumination, the landscape seems even more peaceful, more removed from anything violent or urgent, just fields and hedgerows, a church steeple in the distance, the smoke from a cottage chimney rising straight up in still air. There is comfort in this, in the way nature reclaims what history has marked, in the persistence of seasons and weather, in the fact that spring always returns, that seeds germinate and flowers bloom regardless of what transpired, that the world continues its slow turning, indifferent to human drama, constant in its inconstancy. I find myself thinking about all those individual lives, the millions of people whose stories we will never know, the conscript from Normandy who died at Eylau, the Prussian officer who surrendered at Jena, the Spanish guerrilla who fought in the mountains, the Russian peasant whose village was burned, the British sailor at Trafalgar, the Austrian gunner at Wagram, each one a complete universe, each one with hopes and fears, with people who loved them, with dreams that ended or were forever altered. History tends to remember the commanders, the emperors and generals whose names appear in accounts, whose decisions shaped campaigns, but the substance of history, the actual human experience of it, belonged to all those others, the unnamed multitudes who marched and fought and suffered and died, or who survived and tried to rebuild, who carried the weight of memory, who had to find ways to live with what they had done and what had been done to them. The wind picks up slightly, moving through the grass with a sound like distant voices, like whispered conversations too far away to distinguish words. And I imagine for a moment that I can hear them, all those voices telling their stories to the empty air, to the patient earth, knowing they will not be answered, not seeking answers, simply testifying to the fact that they existed, that they were here, that their lives mattered. Darkness is beginning to gather at the edges of the sky. Not yet night, but the promise of it, that slow transition when colors deepen and shadows lengthen, when the world takes on a quality of hushed expectation, and it feels appropriate somehow, this gradual fading, this gentle movement from light into darkness, from clarity into mystery. The Napoleonic Wars ended more than 2 centuries ago now. The last veteran died long ago. The last person who remembered hearing first-hand accounts is gone. It exists now only in records and ruins, in museums and memorials, in the ways it shaped what came after, in the invisible currents of cause and effect that still flow through the present, connecting us to that past, whether we know it or not. And perhaps that is enough, to know that it happened, to hold space for the enormity of it, to allow the facts and the feelings to coexist, to recognize both the grandeur and the waste, the brilliance and the brutality, the way individual genius and collective suffering were so tightly braided together as to be inseparable. The field grows dimmer, the details beginning to blur, becoming shapes rather than specifics, and I feel myself stepping back, releasing my grip on the particulars, letting the narrative settle, like dust after a disturbance, slowly returning to rest. There is a bird calling somewhere, a simple repeated note, clearer in the deepening quiet, and a final breeze moves through, touching everything lightly, grass and leaves and the cooling earth, carrying no message, making no claim, simply moving as wind does, as it always has, as it will continue to do, long after every story has been told and forgotten and told again. The light fades further, the horizon becoming indistinct, and I find myself ready to leave this imagined place, this field that is every field and no field, this space where past and present meet and separate, ready to return to my own time, my own concerns, carrying with me perhaps a deeper sense of how quickly moments pass, how vast the sweep of our years, how small and large we all are simultaneously, and in the gathering dusk, in the quiet that settles over everything Peru, there is simply the world, breathing, continuing, holding its history lightly, letting go of nothing, remembering everything in its own silent way. The darkness comes, soft as sleep, deep as earth, and we rest here in this peaceful knowing, this gentle understanding that all things pass and all things remain, held in the patient memory of the land itself. The light comes early in the north woods, filtering through branches that have stood for longer than anyone can remember. And there is something about the way it falls, soft and golden, across the bark of white pine and hemlock that makes time feel different, slower, as if the forest itself is breathing at a pace all its own. I find myself standing at the edge of something vast, not just in space, but in story, where the trees rise like cathedral columns, their trunks so wide that 3 men with arms outstretched could barely encircle them. And in the silence between birdsong, I can almost hear the echo of axes, the creak of leather harnesses, the low voices of men who made their living in these towering groves. This is the world of the lumberjack, though that word feels too small, too simple for what it really meant to work in the great timber stands of North America during those decades when the country was being built, board by board, from the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin, from the pine woods of Minnesota, from the Douglas fir stands of the Pacific Northwest, and the endless spruce forests that stretched across the northern reaches. The era I'm thinking of now, the one that unfolds in my mind like an old photograph slowly developing, spans roughly from the 1870s through the 1920s, though the exact boundaries are soft, like fog at the edge of a clearing, because industries don't begin and end with the turning of calendar pages. They rise like sap in springtime and fade like autumn color, gradually, inevitably. There's something almost mythic about this period, the peak years of the logging camps, when tens of thousands of men disappeared into the wilderness each autumn, when the fall colors began to turn and didn't emerge again until the spring thaw, when the rivers ran high and fast enough to carry their winter's work down to the mills, and it's easy to romanticize it, to picture rugged individuals conquering nature with nothing but muscle and steel. But the truth, as always, is more complex, more human, more worth understanding. The scale of it all is what strikes me first, the sheer magnitude of what was undertaken, entire forests, some of which had been growing since before European contact, were surveyed, claimed, cut, and floated away, transformed from living ecosystems into the raw material of expansion, the lumber that built Chicago after the Great Fire, the timbers that shored up mine shafts in the Rockies, the boards that became farmhouses on the prairie, schoolhouses in young towns, boardwalks in boom cities. And yet, for all that scale, for all that industrial ambition, the work itself was done by hand, by men using tools that would have been recognizable to woodsmen centuries before, axes with carefully shaped handles, cross-cut saws that sang their metallic song through the winter air, and later, as the industry grew, more specialized equipment, peavies and cant hooks for rolling logs, and eventually the first steam-powered machines that hissed and clanked at the landing sites. I think about the camps themselves, rough clusters of buildings set deep in the forest, far from any town, reachable only by logging road or frozen river, and in my mind's eye I can see the bunkhouses, long and low, with bunks stacked too high along the walls, a single wood stove in the center throwing off waves of heat, drying the wool socks and leather boots that hung on lines overhead, the air thick with the smell of smoke and sweat and damp wool, and men too tired to do much more than eat and collapse into their blankets. There's a rhythm to this world, a seasonal pulse that governed everything, and understanding that rhythm is like finding the key to a piece of music, because logging was never a year-round enterprise in these northern forests. It was a winter industry, when the ground froze hard enough to support the weight of loaded sleighs, when horses could haul massive logs across snow and ice, when men could work without the torment of black flies and mosquitoes, and when the cold itself became a tool, hardening the roads, preserving the food, keeping the rivers solid until the time came to break them open. So the story I'm following, the one that winds through these tall trees and across frozen lakes, begins in autumn, when the leaves turn and the air grows sharp, when the call goes out for men to fill the camps, and it stretches through the long darkness of winter, through the hard labor of felling and hauling, through the communal life of the bunkhouse and the cook shack, and culminates in spring, when the ice goes out and the river drives begin, and thousands upon thousands of logs go tumbling downstream, a wild and dangerous finale to months of careful work. The story doesn't begin with the great camps of the 1890s, or even with the first commercial sawmills that appeared along the eastern seaboard in colonial times. It begins much earlier, in the old growth forests themselves, in the centuries of undisturbed growth that created stands of timber unlike anything we can easily imagine today. When European settlers first arrived on the Atlantic coast, they encountered forests that seemed limitless, trees of such size and quality that a single white pine could yield masts tall enough and strong enough for the largest naval vessels, and the British Crown, recognizing the strategic value of this resource, began marking the finest specimens with the King's broad arrow, claiming them for the Royal Navy, reserving them against the needs of empire. This was logging's first incarnation in North America, selective, strategic, focused on the most valuable trees for shipbuilding, and the men who did this work were not yet called lumberjacks. They were simply woodsmen, working in small crews, often in summer when the rivers were navigable, felling giants with axes alone, since the cross-cut saw had not yet come into common use, and the work was slow, deliberate, almost intimate in its scale. The pine forests of New England were the first to feel the systematic bite of the axe, particularly in Maine, where rivers like the Penobscot and the Kennebec became highways for timber, their currents carrying logs to the coastal mills, and small logging operations began to establish patterns that would later be replicated across the continent. The use of river systems for transport, the seasonal nature of the work, the development of specialized tools and techniques. By the early 1800s, the industry was growing, driven by the needs of a young nation building itself up from raw materials, and the technology was evolving too. The crosscut saw, sometimes called a misery whip for the brutal nature of its use, began to replace the axe as the primary felling tool, allowing two men to bring down trees that would have taken a single axeman days to fell. And the lumber camp, as a distinct institution, began to take shape. These early camps were modest affairs, a few rough shelters thrown up near the cutting site, occupied by perhaps a dozen men. Local farmers, often, working the woods during the agricultural off-season to earn cash money, and there was still a connection to settled life, to towns and families that would fade as the industry pushed deeper into the wilderness, farther from the comforts of civilization. But it was the opening of the Great Lakes region, the vast forests of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, that transformed logging from a regional industry into something approaching a national obsession, something that would shape the very character of American expansion, because here were forests that dwarfed even the great pine stands of New England, white pines stretching as far as anyone could see, mixed with hardwoods, with hemlock and spruce, timber enough, it seemed to last forever. The timing was significant. This was the 1840s and 50s, a period of explosive growth, railroads pushing westward, cities rising seemingly overnight, the California gold rush creating boom towns that needed to be built from timber and boards, and the Great Lakes forests were perfectly positioned, accessible by water, by the natural highway of lakes and rivers that connected them to Chicago, to Buffalo, to all the growing markets of the interior. The men who recognized this opportunity, the lumber barons who had become wealthy beyond measure, began acquiring timber rights on an enormous scale, buying land from the federal government at $1.25 an acre, sometimes less. And what they were buying was not just land, but the trees themselves, white pine that had been growing for 200 years or more, resources that had accumulated over centuries, now to be liquidated in decades. And so the camps grew larger, more permanent, more organized. By the 1860s and 70s, a major logging camp might house 50 men, 100 men, eventually even more, and these were no longer farmers earning side money. These were professional woodsmen, men who followed the timber, moving from Michigan to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Minnesota, living most of their lives in the deep woods, in a world governed by its own rules and rhythms. The work itself was being refined into something like a science, or perhaps an art, because there was a right way and a wrong way to do everything in the woods, and the difference could mean the difference between profit and loss, between safety and catastrophe. The sawyers learned to read a tree before they cut it, to understand the lean, the weight distribution, the internal tensions that could cause a trunk to split or kick back when the saw bit deep. They developed a vocabulary for their work, terms that sound almost like poetry when you hear them now. The undercut and the back cut, the holding wood that acted like a hinge, the widowmaker, that terrible phrase for a broken branch caught high in the canopy, waiting to fall on an unwary man below. And every term carried weight, carried the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned these lessons the hard way. The felling itself followed a pattern that became ritualized through repetition. The sawyers would approach a marked tree, one man on either end of the long cross-cut saw, and they would study it, walk around it, look up into its crown to see which way it wanted to fall, because a good sawyer worked with the tree, not against it, used its own weight and lean to guide it down into a clear space where it wouldn't shatter on impact, wouldn't hang up in the branches of its neighbors. Then came the undercut, a wedge chopped out of the side facing the intended direction of fall, and this had to be precise, the angle just right, the depth calculated to leave enough holding wood, and the two men would work in rhythm, their axe blows alternating, chips flying, the sharp crack of steel on wood echoing through the forest. After the undercut came the back cut, started on the opposite side, slightly higher than the deepest part of the undercut, and this was saw work, the long blades sliding back and forth, the men finding their rhythm, pushing and pulling, the teeth biting steadily deeper. And there was an art to it, keeping the saw level, maintaining the right amount of pressure, listening to the sound of the blade, which would change as it moved through the wood, through heartwood and sapwood, through the living core of a tree that might have germinated before Columbus sailed. And then, when the saw had bitten deep enough, there would come a moment of tension, a slight movement in the crown far above, a creaking sound like a door opening, and the sawyers would pull their blade free and step back, calling out timber, their voices ringing through the woods as warning, and the tree would begin its fall, slowly at first, then gathering speed, the crown sweeping down through the air, branches snapping until the moment of impact. A crash that shook the ground, that sent snow showering from nearby trees, that marked the end of 2 centuries of growth in a handful of seconds. But felling was only the beginning. The tree had to be limbed. The branches removed with swift axe work had to be bucked, cut into logs of manageable length, 16 feet, 20 feet, whatever the market demanded and the transportation could handle. And this, too, required skill, required understanding of where the log would be used, how it would be milled, what it was worth. And then came the question of moving it, of getting these massive logs, some weighing several tons, from where they fell to the landing site where they would wait for transport. And in the early days, this was done with horses or oxen, powerful draft animals that could drag a log chained behind them, but only if the ground was right, frozen hard, or smoothed by snow. And this is why winter became the season of logging in the northern forests. The development of the ice road was a turning point, an innovation that sounds simple but was actually quite sophisticated, because these weren't just paths through the snow. They were carefully engineered roadways, graded and cleared during the autumn, then iced throughout the winter by water tanks mounted on sleighs. Men would make runs at night when the temperature dropped lowest, spraying water that would freeze into a smooth, hard surface, a highway of ice that could support enormous loads. On these ice roads, the big sleighs would run, massive sleds piled high with logs, drawn by teams of horses, 2 horses, 4 horses, sometimes 6 or even 8 for the heaviest loads. And the sleighs themselves were marvels of practical engineering. The runners curved and shod with iron, the bunks where the logs rested carefully positioned to distribute the weight. Everything designed to make the best use of winter's temporary infrastructure. At the landing, the logs would be piled, stacked in enormous decks, marked with the company's stamp, a unique pattern of axe marks or paint that would identify ownership even after the logs were mixed with others in the river drive. And all winter long the piles would grow, the accumulated harvest of months of labor, waiting for the ice to break and the rivers to rise. The camps that supported this work were becoming small cities unto themselves, rough and temporary perhaps, but organized with surprising sophistication. There was a hierarchy, a structure, the camp boss who oversaw everything, the walking boss who supervised the cutting crews in the woods, the scaler who measured and tallied the harvest, the barn boss who cared for the horses, the cookie who assisted the all-important camp cook. And there were rules, unwritten but universally understood. No drinking in camp, no fighting, no stealing. Violations could mean immediate dismissal, a long walk back to civilization in the middle of winter. And there was a code, too, a sense of collective responsibility, because in the deep woods, far from doctors or law, men depended on each other absolutely. A broken leg could mean death if your bunkmates didn't care for you. A fire in the bunkhouse could kill everyone if someone didn't raise the alarm. The rhythm of the day was set by the cook's triangle, ringing out in the darkness of a winter morning, 4 o'clock, 4:30, calling men from their bunks to the cookhouse where breakfast waited. Enormous quantities of food, flapjacks and salt pork and beans, strong coffee, and molasses, enough calories to fuel 12 or 14 hours of the hardest physical labor imaginable, and the men would eat in silence. That was the rule in many camps. No talking at meals, just the sound of forks on tin plates, of coffee being poured, of men fueling themselves for the day ahead. Then out into the cold, into darkness that was absolute, except for the lanterns carried by the walking boss, the men moving in a column along the tote road, their breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned the lungs, temperatures that could drop to 20 below, 30 below, even 40 below zero on the worst nights, and yet the work had to continue, because winter was short and the contract had to be filled. The forest in winter darkness has a quality unlike anything else, a silence so deep it seems to have weight, broken only by the crunch of boots on snow, the creak of leather, the occasional crack of a tree splitting in the cold. And as the men spread out to their assigned cutting areas, each team knowing their section, their trees, the forest would begin to wake with the sound of axes and saws, a rhythm that would continue until the light failed again in mid-afternoon. There was a mathematics to it all, a calculation that governed every decision. The cruisers had been through months before, walking the forest with their calipers and notebooks, measuring diameter at breast height, estimating board feet, marking trees with paint or axe blazes, and their surveys determined everything: where the camps would be placed, how many men would be needed, what the winter's cut should yield in lumber. A good white pine, straight and clear, might contain 1,000 board feet, enough lumber to frame a modest house, and a single cutting crew, 2 sawyers and their support team, might fell and process 8 to 10 such trees in a day, perhaps more if conditions were perfect, if the snow wasn't too deep, if the trees fell clean, if nothing went wrong, but something always went wrong. Saws would bind in the cut, trees would hang up in their neighbors' branches, equipment would break in the cold. The swampers followed behind the felling crews, clearing paths, building rough corduroy roads of small logs laid crosswise, creating the infrastructure that would allow the skidding teams to reach the felled timber. And this was hard work too. Unglamorous work, the kind that doesn't appear in the romantic tales of logging, but essential, because without clear paths the horses couldn't work, and without the horses the logs stayed where they fell. The teamsters were a breed apart, men who understood horses with an intimacy that went beyond simple animal handling. They could read a horse's mood by the set of its ears, could sense fatigue or strain before it became dangerous. And they had to, because a horse was valuable, worth $150 or more, far more than a man could earn in a month. And a good team could do the work of a dozen men if they were treated right, if they were fed well and not pushed beyond their limits. I think about those horses often, the Percherons and Belgians, the massive draft animals that were the engines of the logging industry, standing 16 hands high, weighing a ton or more, their breath steaming in the cold air, their hooves the size of dinner plates, shod with sharp caulks for gripping ice, and the care they received was extraordinary. Better housed than the men, their barn warm and weather-tight, their feed carefully measured, oats and hay brought in by the ton, because a horse that lost condition was a horse that couldn't work. The skidding itself was dangerous. Attaching chains to a log, making sure they were secure, then the teamster's call, the horses leaning into their collars, the chain going taut, and the log beginning to move, sliding across the snow, and if the chain broke under load, if it snapped like a rifle shot, the whipping metal could kill, or if a log shifted wrong, rolled unexpectedly, a man could be crushed before he could jump clear. At the landing, the loader crew took over, men with peavies and cant hooks, long-handled tools with a sharp point and a hinged hook, and they would roll the logs up skids onto the waiting sleigh, building the load with care, the largest logs on the bottom, the load carefully balanced, and when the sleigh was fully loaded, stacked higher than a man could reach, it might carry 20 tons, 30 tons, even more on a well-iced road with a strong team. The sleigh roads themselves were maintained constantly, a crew whose only job was keeping them smooth, keeping them iced, the water tank making its rounds at night, and there was an art to getting the ice just right, too thin, and it would crack under the weight, too thick, and the runners wouldn't slide properly, and the road crew became expert at reading conditions, at knowing when to add water, when to let it be, and then the great sleighs would begin their journeys, creaking and groaning under their loads, the horses straining, the teamster walking alongside, calling encouragement, watching for problems. And on downhill grades there was the hay, spread thick on the ice to slow the sleigh, because a runaway load was a catastrophe, tons of logs sliding faster and faster, the team unable to hold it back, and men had died that way, crushed when a load got away from them. The evenings in camp were brief, the men too tired for much beyond eating and collapse. But there were moments, Sunday afternoon sometimes, when no work was done, when someone might bring out a fiddle, or a man with a good voice might sing the old songs, the lumber camp ballads that told stories of the work, of disasters and triumphs, of men who died in the woods, of legendary loaders and sawyers, songs that served as the oral history of an industry, passed from camp to camp, from season to season. There was the jam on Jerry's Rock, about a river driver killed when a log jam broke, and the logger's boast, full of braggadocio and humor, and dozens of others, some with melodies borrowed from Irish or Scottish traditions, the lyrics adapted to fit the North American experience. And these songs did something important. They made sense of the work. They turned hardship into narrative. They gave men a way to understand their place in something larger than themselves. The food in the camps was legendary, not for quality perhaps, but for quantity. A camp cook feeding 50 men through a winter needed to be part quartermaster, part magician, working with supplies that had been hauled in during the fall, barrels of salt pork and flour, sacks of beans and dried peas, molasses by the gallon, dried fruit, canned milk, potatoes stored in root cellars dug into the frozen ground. And from these basic ingredients, the cook would produce meals that workers remembered decades later. Enormous pots of beans baked with molasses and salt pork, stews thick enough to stand a spoon in, bread baked daily in quantities that seem impossible, flapjacks by the hundreds, pies made from dried apples, and always the coffee, strong enough to strip paint, kept hot on the stove all day, because men coming in from the cold needed it, depended on it. The cookhouse was sacred space, the one warm, well-lit building in camp, and the cook's authority was absolute. Even the camp boss deferred to the cook in his own domain, because a good cook kept men fed and content, kept them working, while a bad cook could empty a camp in a week. Men voting with their feet, walking out to find another operation with better food. But beyond the daily rhythm of work and meals, there was the larger pattern of the season to consider, the way autumn turned to deep winter, and deep winter began, imperceptibly at first, to soften toward spring, and this transition was watched anxiously because the entire enterprise was a race against the thaw. All those thousands of logs piled at the landing had to reach the river before the ice roads melted, had to be rolled onto the ice of the river or lake before the breakup came. The spring breakup was an event, a transformation. Ice that had been solid enough to support buildings would suddenly turn rotten, honeycomb with meltwater, and then one day, often with startling suddenness, it would go out, the river breaking free of winter's grip. And this was the signal, the moment when logging transformed into river driving, when a different set of skills became paramount. The river drivers were specialists, men who could walk on floating logs as casually as others walked on solid ground, who could read water, understand currents, predict where a jam might form, and they would follow the logs downstream, riding them, guiding them, breaking up jams with peavies and dynamite, sleeping rough on the banks, eating cold food, working in water so cold it could kill in minutes. And this was considered the most dangerous work in an already dangerous industry. But I'm moving ahead, jumping past the deep winter, past the long months of cutting and skidding, and there's more to understand about that time, about the middle period of the season, January into February, when the work had found its rhythm, when the camp had settled into itself, when the initial excitement of the season had worn off, and what remained was simply the daily grind of labor. This was when injuries happened most often, when familiarity bred carelessness, when the cold was deepest and most unrelenting, when men's attention might wander, and a wandering attention in the woods could mean a saw bite, an axe glancing off and cutting a leg, a log rolling onto a foot, and the camp's medical care was rudimentary at best. Perhaps a foreman who had learned some basic first aid, a medicine chest with iodine and bandages, and the nearest doctor might be a 2-day journey away. The isolation was profound in some camps, particularly those in the more remote areas. There might be no contact with the outside world from November until April. No mail, no news, no visitors, just the closed circle of the camp, the same faces day after day, and this took a psychological toll, led to tensions, to feuds over trivial matters, to the occasional fight despite the rules against it. And yet there was also a camaraderie, a bond formed by shared hardship, by depending on each other in ways that town life never required. Men would speak of their bunkmates, their crew, with a loyalty that lasted lifetimes, would return year after year to the same camp, to work with the same men, because they had learned to trust each other, had survived together, and that meant something. The lumber barons themselves were mostly absent from this world. They stayed in offices in Saginaw or Minneapolis or Seattle. They made the deals, secured the financing, bought the timber rights, but they rarely visited the camps, rarely saw the actual work being done. And this distance, this separation between ownership and labor, was part of what would eventually lead to conflict, to the labor movements that would rise in the early 20th century. But that too is getting ahead of the story. For now, in this middle period, we're dwelling in the late 1880s into the 1890s. The industry was at something like its peak, at least in terms of the old methods, the hand labor and horsepower that had brought it to this point. The camps were larger than ever, more efficient, more productive, and the cut was staggering. Michigan alone was producing billions of board feet annually, entire forests disappearing in a generation. The technology was evolving too, though slowly, incrementally. The cross-cut saws were being refined, new tooth patterns that cut faster, handles designed for better grip, and the axes were works of art in their own way. Hand-forged heads of specific weights and profiles, handles of second-growth hickory, shaped to fit the individual user's hand and swing, and a good axeman could maintain his tools with remarkable precision, sharpening on a whetstone with patient strokes until the edge would shave hair from his arm. But the real changes, the ones that would transform everything but key, were beginning to appear at the margins. Steam power was coming to the woods, first in the form of steam donkeys, stationary engines that could pull logs with steel cables, doing the work of a dozen horse teams, and these machines were cumbersome, required enormous amounts of fuel, needed skilled engineers to operate them, but they hinted at what was coming, at the mechanization that would eventually make the traditional lumber camp obsolete. The railroads were pushing deeper into timber country too, logging railroads, narrow gauge lines built specifically to haul logs, and these opened up regions that had been inaccessible before, areas too far from rivers for water transport, too remote for ice roads, and the railroad changed the economics entirely, made year-round logging possible, eliminated the need for the Spring River Drive, and slowly the center of the industry began to shift from the Great Lakes states toward the Pacific Northwest, toward the vast stands of Douglas fir and redwood. In the Northwest, the trees were different, bigger in a way that defied belief. Douglas firs that could be 10 feet across, 15 feet, redwoods that dwarfed even those, and the logging techniques that had worked in Michigan and Wisconsin had to be adapted, expanded, because you couldn't fall a redwood with a simple cross-cut saw. You needed springboards, platforms inserted into notches, cut high in the trunk, above the swollen base, and the sawyers would stand on these narrow boards, 20 feet above the ground, and work from there, the saw singing through wood that might be 1,000 years old. The scale of logging in the Northwest was industrial from the beginning, less about individual skill and more about machinery, about steam donkeys and high-lead systems, cables strung through the forest like enormous spider webs, and the camps there were different too, less isolated, closer to towns, because the railroads made that possible, and the work was, if anything, more dangerous. The trees so large that when they fell, they could shatter like bombs, sending shrapnel of wood flying in every direction, killing men hundreds of feet away. But back in the Great Lakes region, in the early years of the 20th century, change was coming in a different form. The timber was running out. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in region after region, the great pine forests that had seemed inexhaustible were being cut over. The land left in a devastation of stumps and slash, and the companies were moving on, following the timber, leaving behind communities that had grown up around the mills, towns that suddenly had no reason to exist. There were attempts at conservation, voices raised in concern. Gifford Pinchot and others arguing for sustainable forestry, for replanting, for leaving seed trees. But the industry was not structured to think in those terms. The lumber barons had paid for the trees. They owned them. And the prevailing attitude was to extract maximum value as quickly as possible and then move on to the next stand, the next state, the next forest. The men who did the work, the actual lumberjacks, were changing too, or rather the workforce was diversifying. Where once it had been primarily men of Yankee stock, New Englanders who had followed the timber west. Now there were Scandinavians, Finns and Swedes and Norwegians who brought their own traditions, their own songs, their own ways of working, and French Canadians coming down from Quebec, and later, in the Northwest, Asian immigrants, Japanese and Chinese workers, each group adding to the mix, creating a culture that was uniquely North American, forged from many traditions. The Finns, in particular, left their mark. They brought the sauna to the logging camps, a luxury that might seem absurd in such rough conditions, but which was valued beyond measure, a chance to truly get clean, to sweat out the aches and cold. And they brought their radical politics too, their ideas about workers' rights and collective action, and the industrial workers of the world found fertile ground in the logging camps, where conditions were hard and profits flowed primarily to distant owners. The strikes began in the early 1900s, work stoppages, demands for better food, for safer conditions, for an 8-hour day instead of the dawn to dark schedule that had always prevailed, and some of these strikes succeeded, forcing improvements, while others were broken, sometimes violently. But the very fact of them showed that something was shifting, that the old paternalistic model of the lumber camp was no longer sustainable. World War I brought its own changes, a massive demand for lumber, for spruce especially, which was needed for aircraft construction, and the government took an active role, setting up the spruce production division, essentially militarizing logging in the Northwest. And this brought standardization, safety regulations, improvements in camp conditions, because the government needed production but also needed to maintain morale, needed to keep workers from fleeing to better conditions elsewhere. And then the war ended, and there was a brief boom, and then the economy contracted. And the 1920s brought a different kind of pressure, competition from the South, from the pine forests of Georgia and the Carolinas, where labor was cheaper and the trees grew faster, and from new materials too, concrete and steel beginning to replace wood in many applications, and the market for lumber became less certain, less reliable. The technology continued to advance. The chainsaw was being developed, crude and heavy at first, a two-man saw powered by a gasoline engine, but revolutionary nonetheless, because it could do in minutes what took hours with a crosscut. And the men who used these early chainsaws were pioneers of a sort, learning to handle tools that were dangerous, that could kick back, that required constant maintenance, but that increased productivity enormously. And with each technological advance, fewer men were needed. A crew with a chainsaw and a bulldozer could do the work of 50 men with hand tools and horses. And so the great camps began to shrink, to modernize, men going home at night instead of staying in bunkhouses, commuting to the woods in trucks instead of walking in for the season, and something was being lost, even as efficiency was being gained. The old-timers, the men who had worked in the camps in the 1890s, would shake their heads at the changes. would talk about how soft the modern loggers had it with their power tools and their shorter hours. And there was some truth in that, but there was nostalgia too, a selective memory that forgot the hardship, the cold, the injuries, the men who died young from the work, and remembered only the camaraderie, the sense of being part of something grand. By the 1930s, the Great Depression slowed everything. Mills closed, camps shut down. Men who had spent their lives in the woods found themselves unemployed, and some of them went into the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC camps that were in some ways the descendants of the logging camps, young men living in the forest, doing conservation work instead of cutting, planting trees instead of felling them. And there was an irony in that the skills developed to harvest the forest were now being used to restore it. The Second World War brought another surge, another desperate need for lumber, for the construction of military bases, of ships, of 1,000 wartime applications, and the industry ramped up again. But this time with even more mechanization, with trucks replacing horses entirely, with tractors and loaders, and the number of men needed continued to decline even as production increased. And in the years after the war, in the late 1940s and into the 50s, the last of the old-style lumber camps closed. The bunkhouses were abandoned. The cook shacks fell into ruin, and logging became just another job, still dangerous, still hard, but no longer the all-consuming seasonal odyssey it had once been, no longer a world unto itself. The peak era, the time we've been moving through, was roughly from 1870 to 1920, 50 years when the great northern forests were systematically harvested, when tens of thousands of men spent their winters in the deep woods, when the lumber camp was a distinct and vital American institution, and by the middle of the 20th century it was essentially over, transformed beyond recognition, or simply gone. What remains now are traces, old photographs showing men standing beside enormous stumps, their axes resting on their shoulders, museums, displays of cant hooks and peaveys, a few preserved camp buildings, and the stories passed down through families of grandfathers and great-grandfathers who worked in the woods, who were part of that great extraction, that transformation of forest into the built environment we inhabit today. And there's the land itself, the cut-over regions of Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, where second growth and third growth forests now stand, smaller trees, younger trees, but forests nonetheless, recovering in their own time, their own way, and the clear cuts of the Pacific Northwest, some replanted, some naturally regenerating, the forest slowly reclaiming what was taken. The story has a weight to it, a complexity that resists simple judgments, because it was both an ecological catastrophe and an essential industry, both an exploitation and a livelihood, both a destruction of ancient ecosystems and the creation of the material basis for modern society. And the men who did the work were neither villains nor heroes. They were simply workers, doing what needed to be done, or what they were told needed to be done in the economic and social context of their time. And yet, if we step back from the timeline, from the march of decades and technological changes, and think instead about what it meant, what it really meant, to spend a winter in the deep woods, we might begin to understand something about the human side of all this, about the interior experience of men who lived for months in a world reduced to essential elements, work and weather, food and exhaustion, the company of other men, and the vast silence of the forest. There was a stripping away that happened in the camps of pretense, of social niceties, of everything that wasn't necessary, because when you're working 14 hours in temperatures that can kill you, when you're sharing a bunkhouse with 50 other men, when your survival depends on your strength and your attention and the reliability of your crew, the superficial falls away, and what remains is something more fundamental, more honest, perhaps, than what exists in the comfort of towns and cities. The men themselves were aware of this. You can see it in the letters some of them wrote, in the diaries a few kept, this sense that the woods changed them, made them different from the men they had been, or the men they became when they returned to civilization each spring. And there was often a pull, a drawback to the camps, despite the hardship, because something about that life spoke to them, answered some need that ordinary society couldn't meet. Perhaps it was the clarity of it, the way the work was tangible, immediate. You could see what you accomplished each day. The trees you felled, the logs you skidded, the deck growing at the landing, and there was satisfaction in that, in physical labor that produced visible results, in being part of a crew where everyone's contribution mattered, where competence was respected and incompetence couldn't hide. Or perhaps it was the rhythm, the way the days followed a pattern set by nature rather than by clock time. Up before dawn, because that's when winter dawn comes. Working until the light fails because winter light is precious. Eating when the cook rang the triangle. Sleeping when exhaustion demanded it. And there's something deeply human about living according to natural cycles, something we lose when we're governed entirely by artificial schedules and electric light. The relationship with the forest itself was complex, contradictory even, because these were men whose livelihood depended on destroying what they also, in some way, revered. They knew the woods intimately, could read sign like a language, could identify trees by their bark in darkness, could navigate by subtle landmarks, the shape of a ridge, the sound of a particular creek, and they took a kind of pride in their knowledge, in their ability to survive and work in conditions that would break city men, and yet they were also agents of the forest's destruction. And some of them felt the weight of cutting trees that had been alive since before their grandfathers were born, felt something like guilt, or at least ambivalence, though they rarely spoke of it directly, because what good would it do? The work had to be done, the contract had to be filled, and individual feelings didn't change the larger economic forces that drove the industry, the accidents, the injuries and deaths that were a constant presence, created their own kind of knowledge, awareness of mortality that was immediate and physical. Men saw their bunkmates crushed by falling trees, saw hands mangled by equipment, saw the quick death that could come from a moment's inattention. And this created a particular kind of fatalism, an acceptance that the work was dangerous and you might not survive it, but also a determination to do it well, to not let fear paralyze you, to maintain your skill and attention because that was your only real protection. There were rituals around death in the camps, informal ones, not written down anywhere, but understood. When a man died, his belongings would be gathered, his wages calculated, and someone, usually the walking boss or the camp clerk, would write a letter to his family if he had one, and the letter would be factual, brief, not dwelling on the circumstances, just stating what happened and when. And there would be a collection, usually, men contributing what they could to help with the funeral expenses or to support a widow. And then the work would continue, because it had to, because stopping wouldn't bring the dead man back, and his bunk would be filled by someone new, and within days it would be as if he'd never been there, except in the memories of the men who knew him, who might tell stories about him on Sunday afternoons, who might sing a verse about him if someone made up a ballad. And that was the memorial he got, brief and informal but genuine. The seasons marked time in a way that's hard to understand now, when we can have strawberries in January and heating in August, when climate control insulates us from weather. But in the camps, winter was absolutely dominant, inescapable. It dictated everything: the work, the clothing, the food, the very structure of daily life, and the progression from early winter to deep winter to late winter was something everyone was acutely aware of, because each phase had its own character, its own challenges. Early winter, November into December, was almost optimistic. The cold was bracing but not yet brutal. The days were shortening, but there was still decent light. The men were fresh, eager to prove themselves, and the work went quickly. But then came January, February, when the cold settled in like a permanent condition, when the sun barely cleared the horizon, when every day was a test of endurance. And this was when the camp either came together or fell apart, when leadership mattered, when the cook's skill could make the difference between a content crew and a rebellious one. And then March, when the light began to return, when temperatures moderated, when you could feel spring coming even though snow still lay deep, and there was a quickening, a sense of urgency, because the time for cutting was drawing to a close. The ice roads would soon be unusable, and everything had to be positioned for the river drive. All the winter's work had to be ready, and the pace increased, the hours lengthened. One final push before the transformation from logging to driving. The river drives themselves were a whole other world, a whole other story, and the men who specialized in that work were different from the sawyers and teamsters. They needed different skills, balance and agility, the ability to read water, a kind of fearlessness that bordered on recklessness, because walking on floating logs, jumping from one to another, riding them through rapids, this required a commitment to the moment, a complete presence that not everyone could manage. But even the drives were changing, becoming less necessary as railroads penetrated deeper into timber country. And by the 1920s, the great spring drives were mostly memory. Logs were being trucked or hauled by rail directly to the mills, and something wild was being tamed. Something dangerous and spectacular was being replaced by something safer and more efficient, but also less alive somehow, less vital. And so we come to the end of it, to the fading of the lumber camp era, to the closing of a chapter in North American history. And what lingers is not just the facts, the dates and production figures, the technological changes, but the human experience of it, the texture of that life, the particular quality of existence in those remote camps in the deep woods, the last men who worked in the old-style camps, who lived through entire winters in bunkhouses, who cut trees with crosscut saws and moved them with horse teams. Those men are gone now. The last of them died decades ago. And with them went a certain kind of knowledge, a bodily understanding of work and weather and wood that can't really be reconstructed from books or photographs, though we try, though we preserve what we can in museums and historical societies. What remains in the landscape are the traces, the old railroad grades grown over with brush, the collapsed remains of camp buildings, the enormous stumps, rotting slowly, that mark where the great trees stood. And if you know where to look, if you walk the back country of Michigan or Wisconsin or the Pacific Northwest, you can find these remnants, these ghosts of an industry, and they speak quietly of what happened here. The forests have returned in their way, second growth and third growth, and in another century or two, maybe longer, they'll approach again the grandeur of what was lost. The trees won't be as large, perhaps. The ecosystems won't be quite the same, but there will be forests, life reasserting itself, the patient work of regeneration that proceeds whether we notice it or not. And in the small towns that were once mill towns, logging towns, there are still families who remember, grandchildren of lumberjacks who heard the stories, who preserve photographs, who feel a connection to that history, to the men who came before. And this, too, is a kind of continuation, a remembering that keeps something alive even as the physical reality recedes further into the past. The lumber that was cut during those peak decades, some of it is still in use. Old growth boards in the frames of houses, timbers in the basements of century-old buildings. And this wood has qualities that modern lumber doesn't. The grain is tighter, the wood harder, because it grew slowly in the cold northern climate, and it will likely outlast the buildings it supports, will persist as a material remnant of forests that no longer exist. There's a certain poetry in that, in the way the forest was transformed but not destroyed, changed from living trees into the framework of human habitation. And the men who did that work, who spent their winters in the cold and their springs on the rivers, they were part of a transformation, witnesses to and agents of a change that shaped the continent. And now, as the story winds down, as we reach the natural end of this remembering, what I'm left with is images, fragments, the sound of a crosscut saw echoing through winter trees, the smell of a bunkhouse, smoke and wool and coffee, the sight of a great pine beginning its fall, the crown sweeping down through its own branches, the impact that shakes the ground, and the men themselves lean and hard from the work, their hands scarred and calloused, their faces weathered, standing in old photographs with a kind of dignity, a seriousness, as if they understood they were part of something significant, something that would be remembered, even if they couldn't quite articulate what or why. The peak lumberjack era. Those decades from the 1870s to the 1920s, when the northern forests fell and an industry reached its apex before beginning its long decline, it's a story of transformation, of labor and landscape, of men and trees and the intersection between human need and natural abundance. And it fades now into history, into memory, into the quiet of a winter forest where the wind moves through branches, where snow falls softly on ground that was once camp, where time moves forward but the past remains, layered beneath, waiting for anyone who cares to listen, to look, to remember. The story ends as all stories must, but the forest continues, growing, changing, persisting, and somewhere in the space between what was and what is, the echo of axes, the song of saws, The voices of men long gone still resonate faintly, like a dream half remembered, fading, fading into silence. I notice the forest first, the way silence gathers between the trees like something you could hold in your hands. And in that gathering quiet, there's a kind of attention, the sort that pulls you inward, not towards sleep, though that might come, but towards something older, something that has always lived in the space between what we know and what we cannot name. Language. The word itself feels almost too small, like trying to cup water in your palms. It spills through, it reshapes itself, and yet we use it. We have always used it, long before we understood what it was we were doing. Tonight, I find myself thinking about this, about the way sounds become meaning, the way breath becomes words, and words become everything we have ever known. There's a particular quality to the air when you begin to notice these things, when you start paying attention to the architecture of thought itself. And I imagine, just for a moment, what it might have been like tens of thousands of years ago, when the first human voice shaped itself around an idea, around a need to share what was inside, to make the invisible visible. The darkness around me feels generous, patient, and in it I can almost hear echoes, not literal echoes, but something like them, the accumulated weight of every utterance, every whispered secret and shouted declaration, every lullaby and prayer and joke and argument that has ever moved through human lips. Linguistics, the study of this magnificent complexity. This thing we do without thinking, breathing and speaking and meaning all at once. It asks us to slow down, to look closely at what we've been doing all along, to see the patterns we've been weaving since before we knew we were weavers. And there's something deeply calming about this, about recognizing that we are all, every one of us, walking repositories of linguistic knowledge, that our tongues know things our minds have never formally learned, that we navigate grammatical structures more intricate than any cathedral without ever having seen the blueprints. I think about a child, in any time, in any place, listening, absorbing, building an entire system of communication from the sounds that float around them, and how this happens, how it has always happened, without textbooks or instruction manuals, just the patient accumulation of patterns, the slow recognition of how pieces fit together. The study of language, when you really enter into it, becomes a study of everything, because language touches everything. It's there in the way we remember, the way we dream, the way we organize reality into categories and concepts. It's the medium through which we inherit the thoughts of the dead and pass our own thoughts to the unborn. And tonight, in this quiet space, I want to trace some of these threads, to follow the long story of how we came to understand what language is and what it does, and how it works its particular magic. This isn't a history exactly, though history will move through it. And it isn't a lesson, though there are things here worth learning. It's more like a slow walk through a museum at closing time, when the crowds have gone, and you can stand before each display as long as you like, letting your attention settle, letting the details emerge from the dimness. The field of linguistics, as a formal discipline, as a named pursuit, is relatively young, but the questions it asks are ancient. People have always wondered about language, about its origins, about its diversity, about the relationship between words and world, between sound and sense, and there's a particular texture to these questions of keyword, a quality of infinite regression, because we use language to study language. We're inside the thing we're trying to see clearly, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. And yet, we've developed such remarkable ways of looking, such sophisticated instruments of attention. I imagine the earliest grammarians in ancient India, in classical Greece, in medieval Iceland, listening to their own languages with new ears, beginning to catalog, to classify, to notice the rules hiding inside what seemed like chaos, and how that noticing, that careful attention, was itself a kind of meditation, a way of honoring the mystery by mapping its contours. The landscape of language, if we could see it all at once, would stretch beyond any horizon. Thousands of languages, each one a complete universe of expression, each one solving the same fundamental problem, how to move meaning from one mind to another, but solving it in such wildly different ways. And we'll explore some of these these beautiful variations as we move forward. But for now, in this opening moment, I want us to just appreciate the vastness, the improbable richness of human linguistic diversity, because there's something profoundly soothing about knowing that while you and I might share a language, there are people right now in this same moment speaking in ways so different from our own that we couldn't even imagine the sounds without hearing them, using grammars that organize reality according to principles we've never encountered. And yet, all of it, all of these thousands of systems, they all work. They all accomplish the fundamental task of human communication. The night deepens around these thoughts, and I feel ready to begin the journey properly, to step into the long unfolding story of how we came to understand this thing we do, this speaking, this meaning-making, this most human of all human capacities. The story begins, as so many stories do, not with a single moment, but with a slow accumulation of attention, with people noticing, with the gradual recognition that language itself could be examined, could be understood as a system, as something with rules and patterns that existed whether we acknowledged them or not. In ancient India, is more than 2,000 years before the Common Era, there were scholars who listened to Sanskrit with extraordinary precision, who heard not just meaning but structure, not just communication but form, and they began to write down what they heard, to create grammars that cataloged every inflection, every modification, every subtle shift in sound that carried a shift in meaning. Panini, whose name we still speak with reverence, composed what might be the most elegant grammar ever written, sometime around the 4th century before the Common Era, a work called the Ashtadhyayi, which means simply 8 chapters. But within those chapters was contained a system so sophisticated, so economically brilliant, that modern linguists still marvel at its construction. He didn't write in sentences as we might expect, but in sutras, compressed formulas, each one a kind of seed from which understanding could grow. And these sutras described Sanskrit with such precision that if you understood the system, you could generate any grammatically correct Sanskrit utterance and recognize any deviation from correctness. This wasn't just description. It was something deeper. It was the recognition that beneath the surface variety of speech, there existed rules, consistent principles, and that these principles could be made explicit, could be taught, could be preserved. The motivation was partly spiritual, partly practical. The Vedic texts were sacred, and they needed to be transmitted with perfect accuracy. Every sound mattered, every accent and duration and aspiration, because the power of the mantras resided not just in their meaning, but in their exact phonetic form. So the ancient Indian grammarians developed a science of sound, phonetics, before it was called phonetics. They mapped the positions of the tongue, the movements of the lips, the engagement of the vocal cords. They understood voiced and voiceless consonants, aspirated and unaspirated. They knew about places of articulation in the mouth, and they organized this knowledge into systematic classifications. And there's something almost musical about this attention, this loving precision, the way they listened to language as a musician might listen to a composition, hearing not just the notes, but the relationships between notes, the patterns that gave structure to sound. Meanwhile, in another part of the ancient world, Greek philosophers were asking different questions about language, questions about its relationship to reality, about whether words were natural or conventional, whether the connection between a sound and its meaning was arbitrary or somehow essential. Plato, in his dialogue Cratylus, explored this tension, presenting arguments on both sides. One character suggesting that names are natural, that they somehow capture the essence of what they name. Another arguing that names are merely conventional, agreed upon labels that could just as easily be otherwise. And Plato left the question beautifully unresolved, hanging in the air like an invitation to keep thinking. Aristotle, with his systematic mind, his drive to categorize and classify, began to develop concepts that would shape linguistic thinking for millennia. He identified parts of speech, noun and verb. He thought about tense and case, about the relationship between language and logic, about how statements could be true or false, how premises could lead to conclusions. His work wasn't primarily about language. It was about thought, about reasoning, about the structure of knowledge. But language was the medium through which thought moved. And so understanding language became necessary for understanding thought itself. The Greeks gave us the word grammar from grammatic techne, the art of letters, and they began to codify the rules of Greek to describe its structure, though their descriptions were often tangled up with prescriptions, with ideas about how language should be rather than simply how it was. Centuries passed, and the Roman grammarians built on Greek foundations, Donatus and Priscian, names that echo through the history of education, wrote Latin grammars that would be copied and studied for more than 1,000 years, their work becoming the template through which medieval Europe understood language itself. But these ancient grammarians, sophisticated as they were primarily concerned with particular languages, with Sanskrit or Greek or Latin. They didn't yet have the comparative perspective, the recognition that studying many languages together might reveal something about language in general, about the human capacity for speech itself. That comparative vision, that broader perspective, would take time to develop, would require contact between cultures, the collision and mixing of linguistic communities, the slow accumulation of knowledge about just how differently human languages could be structured. In medieval Iceland, the first grammatical treatise, written by an unknown author in the 12th century, showed remarkable phonological insight. The author had studied Latin grammar, but recognized that Icelandic had sounds that Latin didn't, and rather than forcing Icelandic into Latin categories, he developed new symbols, new ways of representing the distinctive sounds of his own language. This was a kind of linguistic independence, a recognition that each language had its own integrity, its own system, and that understanding required flexibility, required meeting the language on its own terms, rather than imposing foreign categories. The medieval period saw the rise of speculative grammarians, the modistes, who believed that grammar reflected the structure of reality, that there was a universal grammar underlying all languages, a common logical framework. They were wrong in many of their specifics, but the impulse toward universals, toward finding what all languages share, that impulse would return again and again in linguistic thought. And then, gradually, Europe began to wake to the diversity of world languages. Explorers and missionaries encountered languages utterly unlike Latin or Greek, languages that seemed to organize reality differently, that had grammatical categories European languages lacked, that lacked categories European languages took for granted. The age of exploration, for all its violence and exploitation, its colonial horror, did bring languages into contact, did force European scholars to confront linguistic structures they had never imagined, Nahuatl and Quechua, Tamil and Tagalog, languages that couldn't be understood through Greco-Roman grammatical frameworks, that demanded new approaches, new tools of description. Missionaries learning indigenous languages to convert souls often became, almost inadvertently, documenters of linguistic diversity. They wrote grammars and dictionaries. They tried to map these strange new sound systems onto familiar alphabets. And in doing so, they preserved records of languages that would later vanish or transform beyond recognition. But still, the study of language remained fragmented, scattered across different traditions, different purposes. There wasn't yet a unified field, a discipline that studied language for its own sake, that asked systematic questions about how language worked, how it changed, how it was acquired, how it related to mind and culture and society. The 18th century brought new currents of thought, the Enlightenment's faith in reason, in systematic inquiry, in the possibility of understanding nature through observation and classification, and language as a natural phenomenon, as a human universal, began to attract this systematic attention. Scholars began to notice striking similarities between languages separated by vast distances, between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, between Persian and the Germanic languages, patterns of correspondence that seemed too regular to be accidental, that suggested some kind of historical connection, some common ancestry. Sir William Jones, a British judge working in India in the late 1700s, made an observation that would transform linguistic study. He noticed that Sanskrit bore a striking resemblance to Greek and Latin, not just in vocabulary, but in grammatical structure, in the very architecture of the language. And he suggested in a lecture delivered in 1786 that these languages must have sprung from a common source, perhaps no longer existing. This was the birth, or perhaps the articulation, of comparative linguistics, the recognition that languages were related, that they formed families, that they evolved and changed over time according to regular principles, and that by comparing languages carefully, by identifying systematic correspondences, scholars could reconstruct linguistic prehistory, could trace the branching paths by which modern languages descended from ancient ancestors. The early 1800s saw an explosion of comparative work. Scholars like Rasmus Rask and Franz Bopp and Jacob Grimm, the same Grimm who would later collect fairy tales, they began to work out the regular sound correspondences between related languages to show that when Latin had a PA sound, Germanic languages often had an F, that these weren't random variations, but systematic shifts, sound laws that operated with almost mathematical regularity. Jacob Grimm formulated what came to be known as Grimm's Law, describing a pattern of consonant shifts that had occurred in the Germanic languages, showing how Proto-Indo-European stops had systematically shifted, how you could predict what sound would appear in one language based on what appeared in another. And this regularity, this law-like behavior suggested that language change wasn't chaotic, wasn't arbitrary, but followed principles that could be discovered and described. The neo-grammarians, Die Junggrammatiker, a group of German scholars in the late 1800s, pushed this insight to its extreme. They insisted that sound laws admitted no exceptions, that if a sound change occurred, it occurred everywhere in the language, in every word that met the right conditions, and that apparent exceptions must be explained by other factors, by analogy or borrowing or some other systematic process. This was a radical position, one that treated linguistic change as a natural science, subject to laws as regular as those governing physics or chemistry. And while the strictest version of this view would later be modified, softened, the fundamental insight remained that language change was systematic, that it could be studied scientifically, that history left traceable patterns in the structure of language, and this systematic approach, this scientific rigor, opened doors that had been closed for centuries. Suddenly, language wasn't just a tool for communication or a repository of culture or a marker of identity. It was also a natural phenomenon, something that could be studied with the same methods used to study geology or biology, something with its own patterns and principles and history. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical ancestor of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and Persian and Celtic and Germanic and Slavic and dozens of other language families, became a great collaborative project of 19th century scholarship. Scholars working backwards from known languages, comparing vocabularies, identifying sound correspondences, slowly piecing together a language that had never been written down, that had vanished millennia before writing reached the people who spoke it. They reconstructed not just sounds but words, not just words but meanings. They could say with reasonable confidence that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European had a word for father, for mother, for brother and sister and daughter and son. They had words for animals, for horse and cow and sheep and wolf. They had words for natural phenomena, for snow and star and moon and sun. And from these reconstructed vocabularies, scholars tried to imagine where these people had lived, what their culture had been like, what animals and plants and landscapes they had known. This was linguistic paleontology, recovering vanished worlds from the traces left in living speech, and it carried a certain poetry, a certain romance The idea that every word we speak connects us to speakers long dead, that language is a kind of time machine, carrying ancient patterns forward into the present. But even as comparative linguistics flourished, as Indo-European studies dominated the field, there were scholars asking different questions. Questions not about historical relationships, but about synchronic structure, about how languages worked as systems at a given moment in time, regardless of their history or origins. Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist working at the turn of the 20th century, would fundamentally reorient the field, though ironically his most influential work wasn't published until after his death, compiled from students' lecture notes, assembled into a book called The Course in General Linguistics. Saussure made a crucial distinction between langue and parole, between language as an abstract system, the set of rules and patterns shared by a community, and language as actual speech, the concrete utterances produced by individuals. And he argued that linguistics should focus primarily on langue, on the system, because that's what speakers actually know. That's what makes communication possible. He also distinguished between synchronic and diachronic study, between analyzing language at a single point in time and tracing its historical development. And while both were valuable, he suggested that synchronic analysis was logically prior. You needed to understand how a language system worked before you could meaningfully study how it changed. Perhaps most importantly, Saussure articulated the principle that the linguistic sign, the connection between sound and meaning, between what he called the signifier and the signified, was fundamentally arbitrary. There's no natural reason why the sound tree should mean tree, or why arbre should mean the same thing in French, or Baum in German. The connection is conventional, established by social agreement, maintained by community practice. This arbitrariness, this conventionality, was crucial because it meant that language was a self-contained system, a structure of relationships, where each element derived its value not from any external reference, but from its position within the system, from its differences from other elements. A word meant what it meant, not because of any inherent connection between sound and sense, but because it wasn't other words, because it occupied a particular position in a network of contrasts and oppositions. Big means what it means partly because it isn't small, hot, because it isn't cold. Language was a system of differences, of values created through relationship and opposition. This structuralist insight, this way of thinking about language as system rather than substance, would ripple out far beyond linguistics. It would influence anthropology and literary criticism, psychology and philosophy. It would become one of the defining intellectual movements of the 20th century, but at its heart, it was an insight about language, about how meaning emerges from structure, from pattern, from the elegant architecture of differences. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American linguists were developing their own approaches, shaped by their own intellectual contexts and practical challenges. Franz Boas, an anthropologist working with indigenous languages of North America, emphasized the need to describe each language on its own terms, to resist the temptation to impose familiar categories from European languages onto radically different systems. He and his students, Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield and others, documented languages that were vanishing, that were threatened by colonization and forced assimilation, and in documenting them, they encountered grammatical structures that challenged every assumption about what language could be. Languages with noun classes based on shape or animacy rather than gender. Languages where the verb carried information about the shape or consistency of its object. Languages with evidential markers that specified how the speaker knew what they were claiming, whether through direct perception or inference or hearsay. Grammatical distinctions that English simply didn't make, that English speakers didn't even think to make. Sapir, with his poet's sensibility, his feeling for the aesthetic dimensions of language, wrote about linguistic relativity, about the possibility that the language you speak shapes how you think, how you perceive, how you carve up the continuous flow of experience into discrete categories. His student Benjamin Lee Whorf would develop this idea further, though often in ways Sapir himself might not have endorsed. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as it came to be known, suggested in its strongest form that language determines thought, that speakers of different languages literally inhabit different cognitive worlds. And while this strong version has been largely rejected, there's still fascinating research on weaker forms, on how language might influence rather than determine, might make certain thoughts easier or harder, might direct attention in particular ways. Bloomfield, taking a very different approach, tried to make linguistics rigorously scientific, to base it on observable behavior rather than introspection or intuition. His approach, called structural linguistics, or sometimes American descriptivism, focused on distribution, on what elements could appear where, on the patterns of combination that defined grammatical structure. He wanted linguistics to be objective, empirical, free from mentalism, from appeals to meaning or intention or mental states. And while this behaviorist framework would eventually be challenged, the descriptive techniques Bloomfield developed, the careful attention to phonological and morphological patterns, the systematic methods for analyzing linguistic structure, these became fundamental tools of the field. The mid-20th century brought another revolution, another fundamental reorientation of how linguists thought about their subject. And this revolution came from an unexpected source, a young scholar at MIT trained in mathematics and logic, whose work would transform not just linguistics but cognitive science more broadly. Noam Chomsky, in a review published in 1959, systematically dismantled the behaviorist approach to language, arguing that language acquisition couldn't be explained by stimulus and response, by reinforcement and conditioning, because children produced sentences they'd never heard, because they extracted rules from limited input, because the linguistic knowledge they developed was far richer than the evidence available to them. This was the poverty of the stimulus argument, the observation that what children learn about language vastly exceeds what they could logically derive from the examples they hear. And Chomsky's solution was to propose that humans are born with an innate language faculty, a universal grammar, a set of principles and parameters that constrain and guide language acquisition. Language, in this view, wasn't learned the way you might learn to ride a bicycle or memorize multiplication tables. It was grown, developed, triggered by exposure to a particular linguistic environment. Children didn't need to be taught grammar. They already knew it. Deep down, they just needed to figure out which specific language they were hearing, which parameter settings applied to their particular linguistic community. This nativist position, this emphasis on innate biological endowment, sparked fierce debates that continue to this day, but it also opened up new research programs, new questions about what exactly was innate, about how universal grammar might be instantiated in the brain, about the relationship between language and other cognitive capacities. Chomsky's technical contributions were equally revolutionary. He developed formal theories of syntax, transformational grammar, phrase structure rules, the distinction between deep structure and surface structure, ways of representing the hierarchical organization of sentences, the relationships between elements that might be far apart on the surface, but closely connected in underlying structure. He showed that you could have sentences with the same surface form, but different underlying structures, like John is eager to please and John is easy to please, where John is the one doing the pleasing in the first, but receiving it in the second. And he showed that understanding these sentences required access to abstract structural relationships that went beyond the linear sequence of words. The Chomskyan revolution, as it's often called, made linguistics more formal, more mathematical, more focused on competence rather than performance, on the abstract knowledge that underlies linguistic ability rather than the messy details of actual language use. And while this approach had its critics, while many felt it neglected important aspects of language, its social dimensions, its variation, its use in real communicative contexts, it undeniably energized the field, attracted brilliant minds from mathematics and philosophy and computer science, turned linguistics into a hub of cognitive science. The late 20th century saw linguistics fragment into subfields, into specializations. Phonology studying sound systems, morphology studying word structure, syntax studying sentence structure, semantics studying meaning, pragmatics studying language use in context, sociolinguistics studying variation and change, psycholinguistics studying acquisition and processing, neurolinguistics studying the brain bases of language, computational linguistics developing algorithms and models. Each subfield developed its own methods, its own theoretical frameworks, its own debates and controversies. But they all shared a common subject, this extraordinary human capacity, this ability to map sounds to meanings, to combine elements in endlessly creative ways, to communicate thoughts and feelings and ideas with remarkable precision and flexibility. And researchers discovered, again and again, that language was more complex than anyone had imagined, that even the simplest utterance involved intricate coordination of perceptual and motor and cognitive systems, that children acquiring language were solving computational problems of staggering difficulty, that the human brain had specialized regions and circuits dedicated to linguistic processing, that damage to specific areas could produce specific linguistic deficits, aphasia that affected grammar but spared vocabulary, or vocabulary but spared grammar. The study of signed languages, languages that use gesture rather than sound, revealed that the human language capacity wasn't tied to any particular modality, that deaf communities developed fully complex languages with all the grammatical sophistication of spoken languages, organized in space rather than time, and that children exposed to signed languages acquired them in the same stages with the same ease as hearing children acquired spoken languages. This expanded the very definition of language, showed that what mattered wasn't sound, wasn't the vocal tract, but rather the abstract principles of combination and structure, the ability to map form to meaning, to create unlimited expressions from limited means. The closing decades of the 20th century brought an increasing awareness of linguistic diversity as both a scientific treasure and a fragile resource. Researchers began to document just how many languages existed in the world, how they were distributed, how many speakers each had, and the numbers were staggering, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages, spoken by 7 billion people, an almost unimaginable variety of ways that human communities had solved the problem of communication. But alongside this documentation came a darker realization that languages were disappearing at an alarming rate, that globalization and urbanization and political pressure were leading speakers to abandon their ancestral languages, to shift to dominant regional or national languages, and that at current rates, half of the world's languages might vanish by the end of the 21st century, taking with them unique ways of organizing experience, unique stores of cultural knowledge, unique solutions to the puzzle of how to speak. This sparked urgent efforts at language documentation. Linguists working with communities to record endangered languages, to create grammars and dictionaries, to develop writing systems where none existed, to preserve at least some record of languages that might soon have no living speakers. And this work brought linguists into closer contact with communities, raised questions about who owns language, who has the right to study it, how linguistic research could serve rather than exploit the people whose languages were being documented. The field began to reckon with its colonial past, with the ways that language study had sometimes been complicit in cultural destruction, with how missionaries and administrators had used linguistic knowledge to facilitate control and conversion, and a new ethic emerged, one that emphasized collaboration, that respected community ownership of linguistic knowledge, that saw language documentation not as extraction, but as partnership. At the same time, technology was transforming what was possible in linguistic research. Computers allowed for the analysis of a massive corpora, collections of texts or transcripts, revealing patterns that would have been invisible to researchers working with small samples, showing how frequently particular words or constructions appeared, in what contexts, with what collocations and associations, speech recognition and synthesis, machine translation, natural language processing. These computational applications both drew on and contributed to theoretical linguistics. They required explicit formal models, precise specifications of grammatical rules, and they revealed the extraordinary difficulty of tasks that humans performed effortlessly, the contextual knowledge, the pragmatic inference, the handling of ambiguity that underlies even simple conversation, the dream of machine translation, dating back to the early days of computing, had proven far more difficult than anyone expected. Early systems produced famously garbled translations, and it became clear that translating between languages required not just matching words, but understanding meaning, not just applying rules, but grasping context, not just processing syntax, but interpreting intention, but gradually, with the development of statistical approaches and later neural networks and deep learning, machine translation improved. Systems that learned the patterns from vast amounts of translated text, that didn't rely on hand-coded rules but discovered regularities through exposure to examples. And while these systems still made errors, still missed nuances, still struggled with idioms and cultural references, they demonstrated that some aspects of linguistic knowledge could be extracted from data, could emerge from pattern recognition rather than explicit instruction. Neuroscience contributed new tools and new perspectives. Brain imaging technologies, fMRI and PET scans, and EEG, allowing researchers to observe the living brain as it processed language, to identify regions that activated during speech production or comprehension, to track the millisecond by millisecond unfolding of linguistic processing. Researchers found that language wasn't localized to a single area, but distributed across networks. That Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the classical language regions identified from 19th century lesion studies, were part of larger circuits, that processing grammar and processing meaning recruited overlapping but distinguishable neural systems, that the brain's response to linguistic violations, to sentences that broke grammatical rules, showed distinctive electrical signatures. The study of bilingualism revealed remarkable plasticity, showed that the brain could maintain multiple language systems, could switch between them flexibly, that learning a second language changed neural structure, and that these changes depended on age of acquisition, on proficiency, on how the languages were used, challenging earlier assumptions about critical periods and native-like attainment. Evolutionary linguistics emerged as a vibrant field, asking how language evolved, what precursors existed in other species, what genetic changes might have enabled human linguistic capacity. And while many questions remained deeply controversial, while the evidence was necessarily fragmentary, researchers made progress on understanding the evolutionary context, the selective pressures, the cognitive prerequisites that had to be in place before language could emerge. Studies of animal communication, of bird song and whale song, of primate calls and bee dances, revealed sophisticated systems, but none with the full combinatorial power of human language, none with the same recursive structure, the ability to embed phrases within phrases, to generate unlimited novel expressions from finite means. And this suggested that while many animals communicated, while many had signals and calls and displays, language as humans practiced it was genuinely unique, the product of specific evolutionary innovations. The FOXP2 gene, discovered through the study of a family with severe speech and language difficulties, provided the first concrete link between genetics and language. Mutations in this gene disrupted the ability to coordinate the fine motor movements required for speech, and comparative studies showed that the human version of FOXP2 differed from that in other primates, that these differences had arisen relatively recently in evolutionary time, though the gene itself was ancient, involved in many aspects of development, not a language gene in any simple sense, but one piece of the complex genetic architecture underlying linguistic ability. Fieldwork continued. Linguists traveling to remote regions, documenting languages spoken by small communities, and these descriptions revealed again and again how inadequate our theoretical frameworks were, how they'd been shaped by the familiar languages of Europe and Asia, how they struggled to account for the full range of human linguistic diversity. Languages with objects that preceded verbs, with verbs that came at the very end of sentences, languages with no clear distinction between nouns and verbs, languages with elaborate systems of classifiers, of evidentials, of tense and aspect markings that tracked information European languages ignored, languages that incorporated gestures as grammatical elements, that used iconicity, direct resemblance between form and meaning, in ways that challenged Saussure's principle of arbitrariness. Researchers working on these languages developed new theoretical frameworks, new ways of thinking about universals and variation, some arguing that diversity was so profound that the search for universal grammar was misguided, that languages were fundamentally different systems, shaped by history and culture and communicative needs. Others arguing that beneath surface diversity there were indeed deep commonalities, but that these commonalities were more abstract, more flexible than earlier theories had proposed. The field fractured into schools, into competing approaches: Chomskyan generative grammar, cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, functional typology, each with its own assumptions, its own methodologies, its own journals and conferences and training programs. And while this fragmentation sometimes felt divisive, it also reflected vitality, the existence of multiple productive research programs, multiple ways of asking questions about language, and through all these developments, all these theoretical debates and technical advances, there remained something fundamentally mysterious about language, something that resisted complete explanation. The fact that every neurologically typical child exposed to language acquired it, that they did so rapidly, effortlessly, without formal instruction, that they became fluent speakers of systems of immense complexity, that they could produce and comprehend sentences they'd never encountered before, that they could use language not just to communicate, but to think, to plan, to remember, to imagine. Researchers studied language acquisition in increasingly fine detail, tracking children's early vocalizations, their first words, their explosion into multi-word utterances, their mastery of grammatical morphemes, their growing ability to handle complex syntax, and they found remarkable regularities, stages that children passed through, errors that were systematic rather than random, over-regularizations where children applied rules too broadly, saying "goed" instead of "went," revealing that they were extracting patterns, forming hypotheses, actively constructing grammar rather than passively absorbing it. But they also found variation, individual differences in pace and style, in whether children began with hollow phrases, single words standing for whole meanings, or with telegraphic multi-word combinations, differences that correlated with temperament, with environment, with the linguistic input children received, showing that while the broad trajectory was universal, the details were shaped by individual and cultural factors. The study of language disorders, of specific language impairment, of dyslexia, of autism spectrum conditions and their variable impact on linguistic development, revealed dissociations, cases where linguistic abilities were impaired while other cognitive capacities were intact, or where language developed normally despite cognitive impairments in other domains. And these dissociations supported the idea that language was in some sense modular, a distinct system with its own neural basis and developmental trajectory. Sociolinguistics flourished, documenting the social stratification of linguistic variation, how pronunciation and grammar and vocabulary varied by class, by region, by ethnicity, by gender, by age, showing that language wasn't uniform even within a single community, that speakers commanded multiple varieties, that they shifted between them depending on context, on audience, on the identity they wanted to project. William Labov's work on sound change and progress, tracking how vowel pronunciations were shifting in real time in American cities, demonstrated that language change was observable, measurable, that it followed social patterns, spreading through networks, led by particular demographic groups, and that speakers weren't consciously aware of most of these changes. They were happening below the level of explicit attention, driven by social dynamics rather than deliberate choice. The recognition that all languages and dialects were equally valid as linguistic systems, that non-standard varieties weren't corrupted or degraded forms, but legitimate varieties with their own rules and structures, helped challenge linguistic prejudice, the way that dialects were used to discriminate, to deny opportunities, to mark speakers as uneducated or unintelligent, though this recognition in academic linguistics hasn't always translated to broader social acceptance. And as the 21st century began, as new technologies emerged, social media and messaging apps and voice assistants, language adapted, new forms of written communication developed, blending features of speech and writing, creating novel conventions, acronyms and emoji and reaction GIFs, ways of conveying tone and emotion in text. And linguists studied these innovations, these rapid changes, seeing in them the same creative impulses, the same drive to communicate effectively that had always characterized human language use. The field today is vast, multifaceted, drawing on insights from psychology and neuroscience, from anthropology and computer science, from philosophy and education, asking questions at every level of organization, from the physics of speech sounds to the social dynamics of language communities, from the neural basis of grammar to the cultural construction of meaning. And yet, for all we've learned, for all the sophisticated theories and detailed descriptions, for all the brain scans and corpus analyses and computational models, language retains its essential mystery, its quality of being both utterly familiar and deeply strange, something we do without thinking but cannot fully explain, something that feels natural, effortless, but involves computational processes of staggering complexity. Perhaps this is part of what draws people to the study of language, the way it sits at the intersection of so many domains, neither purely biological nor purely cultural, neither completely universal nor entirely variable, a human capacity that is both ordinary, something every community possesses, and extraordinary, something that sets us apart from every other species, that makes possible everything we think of as distinctively human, art and science and history and philosophy, all of it mediated through language, all of it dependent on our ability to mean, to share, to speak. The thing about language, when you really sit with it, when you let yourself feel the strangeness of what we're doing right now, this moment, where marks on a screen or sounds in the air carry thought from one consciousness to another, is that it's almost impossible to believe, and yet we do it constantly, continuously, without marveling, without pausing to appreciate the improbability of it all. Every word is a miracle of shared convention, of collective agreement, thousands or millions of speakers somehow coordinating, maintaining a stable enough system that we can understand each other, but flexible enough that the system can change, can adapt, can incorporate new meanings, new forms, new ways of expressing what needs to be expressed. And beneath the words, there are the sounds, the phonemes, the minimal units that distinguish meaning. And what counts as a phoneme in one language might be a mere variation in another, might not be heard as meaningful. Speakers of Japanese struggling to hear the difference between R and L, speakers of English unable to distinguish the tones that carry meaning in Mandarin or Thai or Yoruba. Our perceptual systems tuned by early exposure, shaped by the particular language we encountered as infants. This raises profound questions about perception itself, about whether we hear what's there or what we expect, whether the categories we've learned impose themselves on experience, create boundaries where the physical signal is continuous. And research suggests both that categorical perception is real, that we do hear phonemes as distinct, but that the categories themselves are learned, constructed through exposure, through the statistical regularities of the language around us. Consider tone languages, where the same sequence of consonants and vowels can mean entirely different things depending on whether the pitch rises or falls, or remains level, or dips and rises. And speakers of these languages hear tone as naturally as English speakers hear the difference between bit and bat. It's part of the word, inseparable from its identity. Yet speakers of non-tonal languages often struggle to perceive these distinctions, to reproduce them, to remember them, or consider grammatical gender, how German assigns der Mond, the moon, to masculine gender, while die Sonne, the sun, is feminine. But Spanish does the opposite, el sol, la luna, and French agrees with Spanish, le soleil, la lune. And none of these assignments reflect anything about the objects themselves. They're arbitrary, conventional. Yet native speakers feel them as natural, as somehow right. Studies have shown that grammatical gender can influence thought in subtle ways. German speakers more likely to describe bridges as beautiful or elegant, using adjectives associated with femininity, because Brücke is feminine, while Spanish speakers might use adjectives associated with masculinity, because Puente is masculine, the grammatical category bleeding into conceptual association, into aesthetics judgment. And this is just one example, one small way that linguistic structure might shape cognition. There are thousands of such potential influences, thousands of ways that the particular language we speak might guide our attention, might make certain distinctions easy and others difficult, might provide ready-made categories for some experiences while leaving others unnamed. The Piraha language of the Amazon, described by linguist Daniel Everett, reportedly has no number words beyond 1 and 2, no way to talk about specific quantities. And Piraha speakers perform differently on certain numerical tasks than speakers of languages with elaborate number systems, though debate continues about how to interpret these differences, about whether they reflect linguistic constraint or cultural emphasis, about whether language determines thought or merely facilitates it. Color terms vary dramatically across languages, some languages having dozens of basic color words, others having only 2 or 3, and while there seem to be universal tendencies, certain colors like red and blue emerging as basic terms across many languages, the boundaries between colors, where blue becomes green or green becomes yellow, these vary and speakers of different languages show subtle differences in color perception, in how quickly they can categorize borderline shades, suggesting that language doesn't determine what we can see, but influences how readily we see it. The question of linguistic relativity, of how language shapes thought, remains one of the most fascinating and contentious in all of linguistics, because it touches on fundamental issues of human nature, on whether we all share a common cognitive foundation or whether our minds are sculpted by the particular languages we speak, whether translation is possible because thoughts are universal, or whether something is always lost, always untranslatable, because concepts are language specific. And the answer seems to be, as with so many things, somewhere in between, that there are universal aspects of cognition, constraints imposed by our shared biology, by the structure of perception, by basic needs and experiences that all humans share, but that within these constraints, language provides frameworks, not templates, habitual ways of thinking that differ across communities, that shape but don't determine, that influence but don't imprison. Every language is both a window and a lens, showing us the world, but also coloring how we see it, offering certain perspectives while making others harder to access. And learning a new language isn't just acquiring new words for old concepts, but sometimes acquiring new concepts, new ways of cutting up reality, new dimensions of experience that your first language didn't name. The Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful interval, the space between things, or the Danish hygge, that sense of cozy contentment, or the Portuguese saudade, a melancholic longing for something absent. These aren't just untranslatable words. They are culturally specific ways of attending to experience, of marking certain feelings or situations as meaningful, as worthy of linguistic encoding. And when you learn these words, when you begin to use them, you don't just add to your vocabulary, you add to your emotional repertoire. You begin to notice the thing the word names, to feel it as a distinct experience rather than just a vague, unnamed sensation, language teaching you not just how to speak, but how to feel, how to perceive, how to be in the world. This is perhaps the deepest gift of linguistic diversity, not just that it provides multiple ways to say the same thing, but that it reveals multiple ways to experience reality, multiple valid perspectives on what matters, on what's worth distinguishing, on how to organize the blooming, buzzing confusion of existence into meaningful categories. And as languages disappear, as communities shift to dominant languages under economic and political pressure, we lose more than words. We lose these perspectives, these ways of being human, these experiments in meaning that evolved over thousands of years, shaped by particular landscapes and histories and needs. The night around these thoughts grows deeper, quieter, and I find myself thinking about the first utterances, the first moments when human vocal cords shaped themselves around intention, when sound became more than expression, became symbol, became reference, became the foundation of everything that would follow. We'll never know exactly how it happened, that transition from animal communication to human language, but we can imagine the slow accumulation of innovations, the first use of a consistent sound to mean a specific thing, the first combination of sounds to create new meaning, the first grammatical patterns emerging from repeated use, the way complexity built on complexity, each generation adding to what they inherited, until language became this magnificent edifice we now inhabit. And every child recapitulates this journey in compressed form, moving from cries and coos to babbling, from babbling to first words, from first words to explosions of meaning, building in months and years what took the species millennia, guided by innate capacities, yes, but also by the patient scaffolding of caregivers, by the linguistic community welcoming them into shared understanding. There's something almost sacred about this transmission, this passing of language from generation to generation. Each child a new beginning, a fresh instantiation of the human capacity for meaning, and each language community a living tradition, maintaining and transforming and handing forward this precious inheritance. The world has gone very quiet now, or perhaps I've just stopped hearing anything but the sound of words forming, of meanings emerging, of this strange loop where language thinks about language, where the tool examines itself, where we use the very capacity we're trying to understand to try to understand it. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's the only way it could be, because language isn't something we have like a possession, like a tool we pick up and put down. It's something we are. It's woven into the fabric of human consciousness, into how we remember and plan and dream, into the very structure of thought itself. As I let these reflections settle, as the need for words begins to fade, I'm left with a sense of gratitude for this capacity we share, for the millions of years of evolution that made it possible, for the thousands of years of cultural development that shaped it, for the communities that maintain it, for the individuals who study it, trying to understand this most human of human gifts. Language asks nothing of us except that we use it, that we speak and listen, that we read and write, that we pass it on, and in return, it gives us everything, gives us the ability to share our inner lives, to build on the knowledge of the past, to imagine futures that don't yet exist, to create art and science and philosophy and jokes and stories and all the endless variety of human expression. The silence that surrounds these final words feels different now, not empty but full of all the possible utterances, all the things that could be said, all the languages that could say them, a silence pregnant with meaning, with the potential for speech, for connection, for understanding. And perhaps this is where we should rest, in this quiet appreciation, this recognition of language as both ordinary miracle and miraculous ordinance, something so familiar we forget to notice it, something so extraordinary it defies complete explanation, something we do, something we are, something that makes us human. The night holds this knowledge gently, the way it holds all knowledge, without grasping, without demanding, just present, just there, like language itself, like the capacity for meaning, like the long history of humans trying to understand their own voices, their own words, their own endless creative impulse to speak, to share, to mean. And in the growing stillness, in the space between thoughts, in the quiet that needs no words, there's just this, the simple fact of language, existing, persisting, connecting us across time and space, linking mind to mind, building bridges of understanding, constructing the shared world we all inhabit. The words fade now, not into nothing, but into everything, into the vast ocean of language that surrounds us, that we swim through, that we breathe, that carries us, generation after generation, forward into whatever comes next. whatever new forms language will take, whatever new meanings humans will create, whatever new ways we'll find to say what needs saying, to share what needs sharing, to be together in understanding